Contract with My Enemy. A Fake Engagement Billionaire Romance. By M. Love. Chapter 1. Dorian Foxwell.
The Meridian coverage had run in 17 outlets by 4:47 a.m., and Dorian had read every single one of them on the treadmill, his feet hitting the belt in a rhythm that matched nothing except his own refusal to stop moving. The data breach was a disaster. His communications team's response had been worse. A 48-hour fumble that read like a confession written by someone who'd never faced a camera, apologizing for things they hadn't done while failing to address the things they had. He increased the incline. Sweat tracked down his spine beneath his compression shirt, and he welcomed the burn in his calves because it was something he could control. Unlike the 3 board members who'd emailed before dawn. Unlike the share price, which would open down by at least 4%. Unlike the fact that his VP of Communications had approved a statement containing the phrase, "We take full responsibility," without specifying what exactly they were taking responsibility for. Dorian had built Foxwell Technologies from a one-room startup into a $12 billion enterprise by understanding that language was architecture. Words built things. The wrong words built the wrong things, and his team had just constructed a liability in public. His phone buzzed. Margot, already at the office despite the hour, confirming that the crisis communications contractor would arrive at 9. He'd forgotten about that. The recruiter had placed someone 2 weeks ago, a boutique consultant, recently available, apparently capable of holding strategy under pressure. He hadn't reviewed the file beyond confirming credentials. He'd been focused on the Viridian acquisition, the integration timeline, the 60-day window that required stable optics and 0 surprises. The Meridian breach was a surprise. The kind that cost percentage points and board confidence, and the specific currency of trust that couldn't be bought back once spent. He stepped off the treadmill at 5:15, showered in water cold enough to reset his nervous system, and dressed in the charcoal suit that hung in the same position it always hung. His penthouse occupied the top floors of the building he owned outright. Private elevator, no shared walls, nothing between him and the glass but air. The city stretched below like a circuit board, lights blinking in patterns that meant something to someone. He did not eat breakfast. He rarely did. Food was maintenance, and maintenance was scheduled for when the day permitted it, which the day rarely did. By 6:30, he was at his desk reviewing the overnight damage assessments. By 7:15, he was on a call with legal about the breach notification timeline. By 8:45, he had spoken to 4 journalists, 3 analysts, and 1 board member who called himself a friend, despite having voted against Dorian's last strategic initiative. At 8:58, Margot informed him the contractor had arrived. He made her wait. Not deliberately, or perhaps deliberately, in the way that everything he did carried the weight of intention whether he'd assigned it or not. He had a clause to review. A timeline to confirm. The contractor could sit in the conference room and acclimatize to the temperature of the building, which ran cold, because he preferred it that way, and because no one had ever suggested otherwise. At 9:12, he walked into the conference room. She was standing by the window. That was the first thing he noticed, not seated, not scrolling her phone, not performing the busy productivity of someone who wanted to appear important. She was looking at the city through the glass with the posture of a person who was thinking about something and didn't require an audience for it. She turned when he entered. Dark hair pulled back in a twist that looked functional rather than decorative. A blazer that fit without trying to impress. Eyes that met his directly, assessed him with the same efficiency he was using to assess her, and did not look away. He felt something shift in his chest. A recalibration. The kind of adjustment his system made when it encountered a variable that didn't fit the expected pattern. "What's your read on the Meridian narrative?" he said, because he didn't do preamble, and he didn't do small talk, and he had 4 hours until the briefing, and no patience for the pleasantries that other people seem to require as lubrication for actual conversation. She didn't blink, didn't bristle. Simply opened the briefing folder on the table, He recognized it as her own submission, which meant she'd prepared something before anyone asked her to, and gave him an answer. The initial statement created 3 separate problems, she said. Her voice was clear, unhurried, the voice of someone who had organized her thoughts before speaking and expected them to be heard. The 48-hour delay read as evasion rather than investigation. The passive construction, mistakes were made, assigned blame to a ghost. And the timeline you promised for the third-party audit is based on industry standards from 18 months ago, which means every outlet covering this is measuring you against benchmarks you're not hitting. She laid this out like a surgeon displaying instruments. Clean. Precise. No wasted motion. Dorian sat. Opened the briefing file. Disagreed with 2 of her conclusions, the sentiment analysis weighting and the projected media cycle duration, and told her so. She told him he was wrong about the audit timeline. Not hedged it. Not softened it with qualifiers or apologies or the careful management of his ego that most people attempted when contradicting him in his own conference room. She told him he was wrong, and then she told him why, citing the shift in disclosure standards and the specific outlets that were using the new framework, and the fact that his current response was landing in the wrong moment because his team hadn't adjusted for a landscape that had changed while they weren't watching. Dorian listened. He listened to the whole argument without interrupting, which was not his default, which was something he would think about later, and when she finished, he looked at her. Her hands were still. She wasn't fidgeting, wasn't performing confidence, wasn't doing any of the things that people did when they were waiting to find out whether they'd overstepped. She was just present. In the room. Occupying the space she'd been given without apology or excess. His eyes tracked the line of her jaw. The way her fingers rested on the edge of the briefing folder. The specific quality of her attention, which felt like being measured by someone who had her own framework for assessment and didn't need his. Start Monday, he said. Today is Monday. The words landed without inflection. A fact. Delivered with the same precision she'd used on the audit timeline. Something almost surfaced at the edge of his expression, not a smile, not warmth, something closer to recognition, and he caught it, contained it, and said, "Then you've already started." She pulled a document from her folder. The contract. He watched her read it, not skim read, her eyes moving through the clauses with the attention of someone who had learned at some point that the details were where things went wrong. Page 4, she said. The IP clause. He knew the clause. He'd approved it without much thought, because it was standard language, the kind of broad protection that legal inserted into everything as a matter of course. It's written to encompass strategic communications frameworks developed during the engagement, she said. I've developed frameworks independently. They're not part of this scope, and I'm not signing them over. She looked at him. Waited. Dorian felt his hand tighten on the edge of the folder before he could stop it. A small motion. Involuntary. The kind of tell he'd spent 15 years training out of his system. Margot, he said without looking away from Wren Calloway. Revise the clause. Margot, who had been standing near the door with the professional invisibility of someone who had learned to be present without being noticed, nodded and stepped out. Wren didn't thank him. Didn't smile. Didn't perform the gratitude that most people offered when he gave them something. She just waited for the revision, read it when it arrived, and signed. He found himself watching her handwriting. The way she formed letters. The specific pressure of the pen against paper. He needed to stop noticing things like that. Margot will show you to your office, he said, standing. The Meridian briefing is in 4 hours. I'll review your draft by 2. You'll have it by 1, she said. It wasn't a promise. It was a fact, delivered with the same precision as everything else, and Dorian found himself walking out of the conference room with the peculiar sense that he had just been handled by someone who hadn't appeared to be handling him at all. His 10 a.m. call was about the Viridian integration timeline. 60 days to close. Stable optics required. Eleanor had sent the board memo again that morning, The one about shareholder confidence and the tabloid piece that had run 3 weeks ago. Something about his relationship history, his pattern of failed engagements, the implication that personal instability signaled professional risk. He'd dismissed it. He dismissed most things that required him to perform a version of himself he didn't recognize. But Eleanor was right about the optics. The merger needed a clean window. And the woman currently setting up in the office 1 floor below his had just demonstrated, in 15 minutes, that she was capable of seeing through the architecture he built around himself to the structure underneath. That was either very useful or very dangerous. He couldn't decide which. At 12:47, the Meridian draft arrived in his inbox. He read it once, found nothing to criticize, and sent back 2 words, approved. Send. He went to her office at 1:15 to discuss the rollout. She was at her desk, laptop open, coffee cooling at the edge of the surface in a mug that looked like she'd brought it from home. She didn't look up immediately when he appeared in the doorway. She finished the sentence she was typing, saved the document, and then raised her eyes to his. The statement goes live at 3, she said. I've briefed Margot on the media response protocol. Your talking points for the analyst call are in your inbox. She had done all of this without being asked. Without checking whether he wanted to be consulted. Without any of the careful deference that usually characterized interactions in his orbit. The Viridian integration, he heard himself say, though he hadn't planned to bring it up. I want your read on the communication strategy. Her eyebrows rose a fraction. That's not in my scope. I'm adding it. She studied him for a moment. Assessing. Running her own calculations behind those steady eyes. Send me the file, she said. I'll have notes by end of week. He nodded. Didn't leave. The silence stretched. Not uncomfortable, that was the strange part. Most silences in his world were contests, tests of endurance, negotiations conducted without words. This one simply existed. She returned to her screen. He remained in the doorway. Was there something else, she asked, not looking up. There wasn't. He invented something, a question about the briefing distribution list, and left before he could examine why he'd wanted to stay. The Meridian statement ran at 3 p.m. By 5 p.m., 2 outlets had called it a model response. By 7 p.m., the preliminary sentiment analysis showed a 12-point recovery in public perception. Dorian sat at his desk and read the coverage and tried to focus on the numbers rather than the specific shade of composure in Ren Calloway's eyes when she'd told him he was wrong about the audit timeline. She hadn't been trying to impress him. That was the thing he couldn't stop returning to. She'd simply known something he didn't, and she'd said so, and she'd been right. He couldn't remember the last time someone had told him he was wrong about something and been right. He couldn't remember the last time he'd wanted them to do it again.
Chapter 2. Dorian Foxwell.
The Meridian statement performed exactly as Ren Calloway had designed it to. I watched the coverage unfold across 6 monitors in my office at 5:47 a.m., the treadmill forgotten, my coffee cooling on the desk beside a stack of board memos I hadn't touched. 3 outlets used the phrase corporate transparency. 2 more called it a measured response in an era of corporate deflection. The share price stabilized by market open and ticked up 2 points by noon. I had sent her one word, effective. I meant something closer to, this is the first communications output from this building in 8 months that hasn't required a damage control follow-up within 72 hours. I did not examine why I had gone to her office 5 times in 4 days. The professional explanation was sufficient. Crisis situations required direct oversight. Her temporary placement on the 34th floor created logistical inefficiency. The Meridian cycle demanded real-time coordination that email chains couldn't provide. All of this was true. None of it was the reason. Margot appeared in my doorway at 6:15 a.m. with the morning briefing tablet and the particular expression she reserved for information she believed I wouldn't want to receive. The board chair's office confirmed Eleanor Stave for your 8 o'clock standing meeting. I'm aware. She's requested an extended slot. 45 minutes instead of 30. I looked up from the coverage metrics. Eleanor didn't request extended slots for routine check-ins. Eleanor requested extended slots when she intended to present something that required my agreement before I'd had time to formulate objections. What's the agenda item? She didn't specify. Margot set the tablet on my desk. Also, Ms. Calloway submitted her final Meridian deliverable last night at 11:04 p.m. The revised statement and supporting documentation are in your secure folder. I saw it. You responded at 11:04 p.m. I met Margot's eyes. She had worked for me for 7 years. She knew better than to comment on my response times, which meant she was commenting on something else entirely. Was there something else? No, Mr. Foxwell. She left, closing the door behind her with the precise click that indicated she had thoughts she was choosing not to share. I pulled up Wren's final deliverable and read it again. The structure was clean: executive summary, tactical breakdown, media monitoring protocol, escalation framework. Every section anticipated the question that would follow it. Every recommendation came with implementation steps and success metrics. She worked the way I worked. Systematic. Anticipatory. Intolerant of ambiguity where precision was possible. I closed the file and opened my calendar. Eleanor's extended meeting sat there like a door I couldn't see behind. Eleanor Stave arrived at 7:58 a.m., which was her way of communicating that she controlled the timing of things, not the calendar. She was 63, silver-haired, and had been managing board dynamics since before I'd founded the company. She carried a leather portfolio and the particular calm of someone who had already decided how a conversation would end. Dorian. She took the chair across from my desk without waiting for invitation. The Meridian coverage is impressive. Your new contractor knows what she's doing. She does. The board noticed. Eleanor opened her portfolio and removed a single printed page. They've also noticed something else. She placed the page on my desk. I recognized the layout immediately. A tabloid clipping reprinted on company letterhead for the dignity of board distribution. The headline read, "Foxwell's Pattern Problem. 2 failed relationships in 18 months signal unstable leadership." I didn't touch the page. This ran 3 weeks ago. And the board has been discussing it for 3 weeks. Eleanor folded her hands. Shareholder anxiety is quantifiable, Dorian. The Viridian acquisition closes in 60 days. The optics window between now and close is critical. If the narrative around your personal life destabilizes during that window, it affects confidence metrics. The narrative around my personal life is not a board concern. It became a board concern when your last relationship ended in a public restaurant with enough witnesses to generate a blind item in TechCrunch. Eleanor's tone remained level. The board isn't asking you to change who you are. They're asking you to manage perception for 60 days. I sat back. What exactly is the board proposing? Eleanor removed a second document from her portfolio, a single-page memo with confidential headers. An image stabilization strategy. 2 public appearances with a credible partner. Controlled narrative. Defined term. I read the memo. The language was clinical. Stakeholder confidence architecture, relationship optics framework, engagement presentation window. At the bottom, a section titled Candidate Profile described someone already embedded in company operations, credibly professional, appropriately positioned. The profile described Wren Calloway. You want me to pretend to be engaged. I want you to project stability for 60 days. Eleanor retrieved the memo before I could object. The contractor is already on site. She's credible, professional, and has no prior public association with your personal life. 2 events, the tech industry dinner in 10 days, the foundation auction 3 weeks after. An engagement announcement, through controlled channels. Clean scope. Defined exit. Did anyone consult her? The scope extension will be presented to Ms. Calloway as an option, not an obligation. Her participation is voluntary, and the compensation is separate from her crisis communications contract. Eleanor stood. Present it correctly, Dorian. She's not a component. She's a professional who can choose to accept or decline an additional engagement. Present it correctly, I repeated. Yes. Eleanor gathered her portfolio. The board meeting is Thursday. I'll need confirmation of her decision by Wednesday close of business. She left. I sat at my desk without moving for 4 minutes, reading the memo I'd already memorized, understanding the precise problem I was facing. For 4 days, I had been finding reasons to appear in Wren Calloway's doorway. For 4 days, I had been telling myself it was oversight, coordination, the normal demands of a crisis cycle. The board had just handed me 60 days of professional justification for proximity I was already engineering without admitting it. I told Margot to give Wren the morning slot tomorrow. Then I spent the rest of the day in back-to-back acquisition calls and did not think about the meeting. I thought about the meeting constantly. At 9:14 p.m., after everyone else had left the floor, I walked past her temporary office. The light was on. I stopped in the hallway, 5 feet from her doorway, and watched her work. She was at her desk, reading something on her laptop that wasn't Meridian-related, a client file from her consultancy most likely. The side work she kept entirely separate from the engagement here. Her hair was twisted up with a pen through it, loose strands falling against her neck. A half-empty coffee cup sat at her elbow, the same dark roast she'd mentioned 3 days ago. She hadn't asked me for the coffee. I'd had Margot arrange it because she'd mentioned where she bought it once in passing, while answering a logistics question about her work schedule. She hadn't needed to ask. She didn't look up. I kept walking. The following morning, I stood in the doorway of her office at exactly 9 a.m. Wren was already at her desk. She looked up when I appeared, her expression shifting into the particular alertness I was beginning to recognize. Not deference, not anxiety, just presence. Full attention, offered without ceremony. Mr. Foxwell. There's a meeting, I said. Conference room C, you'll want to be there. She studied me for a moment. What kind of meeting? The kind where someone presents you with an option. I held her gaze. I want you to know, before you walk into that room, that the option is yours. Not the board's. Not mine. Something shifted behind her eyes. Calculation, assessment, the careful machinery of someone who'd learned to audit offers before accepting them. She stood, gathered a notepad from her desk, and followed me down the hall. Eleanor was already seated when we arrived. The memo sat at Wren's place at the table, face up, headers visible. Wren sat down, read the first paragraph, and went very still. Eleanor explained. The timeline, the events, the optics architecture, the engagement announcement, the compensation structure. She was precise, professional, and utterly institutional, a woman presenting a solution to a problem she'd identified, expecting agreement because agreement was the rational outcome. Wren read the entire memo before anyone spoke again. Then she looked up, not at Eleanor. At me. Is this your idea? The board's, I said. The memo is Eleanor's. The decision is yours. She held my gaze for a long moment. Then she took a pen from the table and wrote something at the bottom of the final page, her handwriting precise and deliberate. She pushed the memo back toward the center of the table. I read what she'd written. Personal decisions made in the context of this engagement require my explicit prior consent. The engagement narrative terminates on my timeline, not the board's. Eleanor paused. That's specific. It's non-negotiable. Wren's voice was level. If you're asking me to participate in something that presents as personal, I require control over how it ends. Those are my terms. I read the handwritten clause again. Then I looked at Wren, At the set of her shoulders, the steadiness in her eyes, the particular clarity of someone who'd learned to negotiate from a position of having lost something she hadn't protected. "Acceptable," I said. Eleanor's expression flickered. "Dorian. The terms are acceptable." I looked at Wren. "I'll honor them." Something moved across her face, not gratitude, not relief, something closer to recognition. She signed the document. Then she looked at the ring box Eleanor had placed on the table earlier. She didn't touch it. I picked it up. I held it out to her. Her fingers brushed mine when she took it. Neither of us acknowledged the contact. The meeting ended. Eleanor left. Wren returned to her office with the ring box in her bag, and I returned to mine with the image of her handwriting burned into my memory. Personal decisions made in the context of this engagement require my explicit prior consent. She had been managing difficult men in difficult rooms for years. She knew exactly what she was protecting against. I sat at my desk and opened the safe behind the panel, the one that held my mother's letters, the thank you notes I'd never answered, the small artifacts of a life I'd built walls around. I didn't take anything out. I just looked. Then I closed the safe, returned to the acquisition timeline, and tried not to think about the fact that Wren Calloway had just agreed to stand beside me in public for 60 days, and that standing beside her was the only thing I'd wanted since she walked into my conference room and told me I was wrong about my own company's audit exposure. At 9 p.m., I walked past her office again. The light was still on. She was at her desk, the ring box open beside her laptop, staring at something I couldn't see. The ring was on her finger. She looked up. Our eyes met through the glass. She didn't smile. Neither did I. I kept walking. The engagement announcement began drafting itself in my head that night. Controlled language, strategic outlets, the architecture of a thing that was supposed to be temporary, and already felt like something I was going to have difficulty letting go. Margot added Wren's name to the building's internal secure access list without being asked. I noticed and said nothing. The tech industry dinner was in 10 days. I had 10 days to prepare for standing in a room full of people who would watch how I looked at her and read the look correctly before either of us would. I opened my phone. Wren's name sat in my contacts, the most recent message, the single word I'd sent her 4 days ago, effective. I typed 3 words and deleted them. Typed them again. Deleted them again. I put the phone down and looked at the city through the glass. 10 days. The engagement addendum started in 10 days. I was already counting.
Chapter 3. Dorian Foxwell.
At 4:45 a.m., the treadmill belt moved beneath my feet, and 3 printed coverage summaries were clipped to the monitor arm where briefs usually lived, because I had learned long ago that the body could be set to a task while the mind did the real work. 3 outlets had used the phrase, corporate transparency, without prompting, without a quote planted by my communications team, because there had been no communications team. There had been Wren Calloway sitting across from me in a borrowed conference room at 11 p.m., telling me my 3rd draft was dishonest without being inaccurate, and that was a specific kind of worse. I'd rewritten it. I'd sent effective, because every alternative I composed felt like something I wasn't prepared to hand her. The treadmill's rhythm was familiar. Predictable. My body knew this pace the way it knew the weight of quarterly projections and the particular silence of a boardroom before I spoke. What my body did not know, what it had apparently decided to develop an opinion about without consulting me, was how to process the fact that I'd appeared in her office doorway 5 times in 4 days. I had the professional explanation ready. She was embedded. The crisis was ongoing. Direct contact was efficient. I deployed it now against the 4:45 a.m. silence, the same way I deployed it during business hours, which was to say I deployed it and believed it approximately 60% of the time. Down from 94 on day 1. The coverage summary on the left showed the Financial Times piece. The one in the center was from a tech publication that had previously called the Meridian acquisition Foxwell's first major stumble. They'd revised their position. The third was an industry newsletter that used the word masterclass without irony. I increased the incline by 2 degrees and watched the city come light through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Eleanor's email from 11:47 p.m. Saturday behind my sternum like a held breath. I'd read it once, the way I read all correspondence regardless of hour, and the note had contained the phrase optics window and the name Callaway in the same paragraph, and I had put my phone face down on the nightstand for the first time in 4 years. I knew what she wanted to discuss before she arrived. Eleanor did not schedule 8 a.m. meetings to deliver good news. She scheduled them to present solutions to problems she had already decided existed, and to offer me the professional courtesy of pretending I had input. The treadmill timer showed 47 minutes remaining. I thought about the specific way Wren had looked at me when I disagreed with her second conclusion about the Meridian timeline. Not afraid. Not deferential. Not angling for approval. She tilted her head exactly 2 degrees to the left and said, "You're wrong about one of them." And then she'd explained why in 4 sentences that were so precisely constructed I could still recall them word for word. I increased the incline again. Eleanor Stave arrived at 7:58 a.m., which meant 8 a.m., because Eleanor understood that 2 minutes early was the architecture of a woman who controlled her own schedule rather than reacting to someone else's. She placed the printed tabloid piece on the center of my desk with the particular precision of someone setting down evidence rather than a newspaper. No apology, no preamble, just the headline exposed. Foxwell's pattern problem: 2 failed relationships in 18 months signal unstable leadership. I read it without touching it. I had read it the night before on my phone, and the night before that when it ran, and I had assessed it then as a 3-day story with no staying power, which was still my assessment. Except that Eleanor's presence in my office at 8 a.m. meant the board had reached a different conclusion, and the board's conclusions had organizational weight regardless of my own. Shareholder anxiety around the Viridian AI acquisition is quantifiable. Eleanor placed a second document beside the tabloid piece. A memo. The board's letterhead. The number is here. The optics window required for the merger's clean close is 60 days minimum. I picked up the memo. Read it once, completely, retaining everything. The board has identified a solution, Eleanor continued, that is already embedded and credible. I set the memo down. Wren Callaway. 2 public events. A defined contract term with separate compensation. Clean documentation. An engagement announcement through coordinated outlets, followed by appearances that demonstrate stability. An engagement. A fake engagement, Eleanor clarified, as though the distinction mattered to anyone but her legal team. Contractually defined. Time limited. She's already here, already visible in your orbit, already professional enough to understand the terms. I did not move. I did not speak. The first response my mind produced was not one I intended to voice aloud, because the first response was a question that had nothing to do with the board's optics strategy, and everything to do with the specific architecture of what Eleanor was proposing. Has anyone asked her? Eleanor's expression didn't shift. The scope extension will be presented to Ms. Callaway as an option with full disclosure of terms, not an obligation. Present it correctly. The register I used was the one I reserved for matters that were non-negotiable in their execution. Eleanor, who had known me long enough to parse it, said, "Of course," and gathered her documents. The door clicked shut behind her. I did not move for 4 minutes. Not stillness performed for an audience. There was no audience, just the particular quality of a man locating the edges of a problem he had not anticipated having. The problem was this: I had spent 4 days finding structural reasons to be in Wren Callaway's vicinity. I had told myself each visit was professionally motivated. I had believed it with diminishing conviction. And the board had just handed me 60 days of documented, contractual, entirely legitimate proximity to a woman I was already finding reasons to be near without admitting the reason. I stood and walked to the window. The city stretched below, indifferent to the specific disaster forming in my peripheral vision. 12 years of building this company. 15 years of understanding exactly what I wanted and engineering systems to acquire it. And now, I was standing in my own office, trying to determine whether the professional opportunity the board had just presented was actually a professional opportunity, or whether it was something significantly more dangerous wearing the costume of a contract. I told Margot to give Ren the morning slot the following day. The next 9 hours passed in the familiar rhythm of acquisition calls, subsidiary reviews, and decisions that affected thousands of people who would never know my name had been attached to their outcomes. 3 calls regarding the Viridian integration. 2 regarding a logistics subsidiary in Singapore. 1 with legal about the Meridian liability exposure, which had decreased by 47% since Ren's statement ran. 11 decisions. 4,000 employees affected, give or take. I did not think about Ren Calloway. I thought about her with a frequency that I could not have reported without admitting it, so I did not report it, even internally. Instead, I identified the specific problem. She had told me I was wrong about one of the Meridian conclusions, and she had been correct, and my nervous system had responded to being correctly contradicted in a way that was entirely inconsistent with my established pattern. My established pattern was to terminate the conversation and the person's involvement simultaneously. I had not terminated anything. I had asked a follow-up question. I was still thinking about her answer. At 2:47 p.m., I walked past her temporary office on my way to a conference call and registered that she was at her desk with her coffee, dark roast, the wrong ratio from the building's machine, but she drank it anyway, and that she was reading something on her laptop with the particular focus of someone who had forgotten the door was glass. I kept walking. At 4:15 p.m., I received an update from Margot about the following morning's meeting. Eleanor would present the engagement addendum. I would be present. Ren would have the option to accept or decline. The word option sat wrong in my chest. At 6:30 p.m., the floor began to empty. My senior staff left in the usual order, legal first, then finance, then operations. The silence that followed was familiar. Useful. The hours between 6:30 and midnight were when I did my best work, when the building's ambient noise dropped low enough that I could think without interference. I worked until 9:03 p.m. on the Viridian timeline, making adjustments that would save approximately 3 weeks of integration friction. Then I stood, collected my jacket, and walked toward the elevator. Her office light was on. I slowed without deciding to. Through the glass I could see her at her desk, back 3/4 to the door, reading something that bore none of the formatting of Meridian materials. A client file from her own consultancy. The kind of parallel work she kept entirely in her own infrastructure, as though Foxwell Technologies were a weather system she was temporarily sheltering from rather than a place she belonged. She did not look up. I kept walking. I had not stopped. Stopping would have required a reason I hadn't yet constructed, and I did not enter rooms without knowing precisely what I intended to accomplish there. The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the lobby. The doors closed. I stood in the descending car and understood the problem with the clarity I usually reserve for hostile acquisitions. I did not know what to do with someone who looked at me as though my opinions were inconvenient data points rather than directives. Someone who worked under my lights at 9 p.m. on her own client's problems without requiring anything from my world. Someone who had told me I was wrong and then waited, entirely calm, while I processed the fact that she was right. Tomorrow morning, she would sit across a table from Eleanor Stave and hear the terms of a contract that had been written around her without her knowledge. I would be present. I had not yet resolved whether her response would register as professional data, useful, accessible, filed, or as something that mattered to me in a way that had no place in any document I had ever signed. The distinction had been clear 4 days ago. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened onto marble and security desks, and the particular quiet of a building after business hours. I walked to the car. Marcus, my driver, had the door open before I reached it. "Home," I said. The city scrolled past the window as we moved through midtown traffic. I thought about the safe behind the panel in my office. Inside it, a box of my mother's letters and every thank you note I had received since founding the company. I had never responded to a single one. I thought about the way Wren had looked up from her contract review on day one, found the IP clause problematic, and asked me to amend it before she signed. No hesitation. No apology. Just the specific expectation that I would fix what was broken because she had identified it. I had fixed it. I thought about the way my hand had tightened on the edge of the folder when she'd made that request, brief, involuntary, something I'd disciplined back into stillness before anyone could notice. Except she might have noticed. She noticed most things. The car stopped at my building. I did not get out immediately. Tomorrow morning, Eleanor would offer Wren a contract that positioned her as a component in an optics strategy designed to stabilize shareholder confidence for a merger close. The terms were clean. The compensation was appropriate. The duration was defined. Everything about it was professional. Everything about it was also a lie I was telling myself, because the truth was simpler and significantly more dangerous. I wanted 60 more days of reasons to stand in her doorway. I wanted 60 more days of her telling me I was wrong about things. I wanted 60 more days of watching her work under my lights at 9 p.m. on problems that had nothing to do with me, existing in my orbit without requiring anything from it. I wanted her. Not as a contractor. Not as a component. Not as a solution to a board-manufactured optics problem. I wanted her in a way I had not wanted anything in years. In a way that had no contract. No terms. No defined duration. The distinction between what I wanted and what I was about to offer her was becoming something I could no longer locate with precision. And precision was the only tool I had ever trusted.
Chapter 4. Dorian Foxwell.
The conference room smelled like expensive paper and temperature-controlled air, and I stood at the window watching the city arrange itself into patterns I'd memorized 15 years ago while Eleanor Stave's heels clicked against the marble floor behind me. 9 o'clock. Precisely. I didn't turn around. I'd learned decades ago that making people wait for my attention was a form of currency, and Eleanor had been trading in the same economy long enough to understand the exchange. She set something down on the table, leather against polished wood, the specific weight of documents that would reshape someone's morning, and waited. Wren arrived 11 minutes early. I knew, because I'd been tracking the elevator panel's indicator light without admitting I was tracking it, and when the doors opened and her footsteps moved across the floor with that particular rhythm I'd cataloged over 4 days of doorway visits, something in my chest shifted into something I didn't recognize. She chose the seat with her back to the wall. Smart. She placed her own pen on the table before anyone could offer her one. Smarter. I turned then, because not turning would have been its own kind of tell, and found her watching me with that level assessment I'd been unable to stop thinking about since she'd told me I was wrong about the audit timeline and proved it in 4 sentences. "Ms. Calloway," Eleanor said, sliding a document across the table with the efficiency of someone who'd been managing boardroom logistics since before Wren had been in grade school. "Thank you for joining us." The word on the cover sheet landed in the room with specific weight. Engagement. Not arrangement. Not appearance. Engagement. I watched Wren's eyes move across the page, methodical, thorough, missing nothing, and I watched her not react to the word, which was itself a reaction I filed under things that make her more interesting than anyone else in this building. Eleanor outlined the terms. 3 outlets for the announcement: financial press, tech trade, 1 lifestyle wire. A tech industry dinner in 10 days as our first public appearance. A charity auction 3 weeks after that. She explained the shareholder anxiety with the clinical precision of someone reading from a brief she'd written herself. The tabloid piece, the pattern narrative, the measurable uptick in uncertainty that had become a board-level optics problem, requiring a visible, credible, time-limited solution. What Eleanor didn't say: the Viridian merger. The 60-day window. The specific reason this quarter mattered more than any other. I watched Wren note the omission. I watched her not ask about it. The exit clause, Wren said, her voice carrying that particular quality I'd noticed the first day. Professionally measured, but with something underneath that refused to defer. What triggers it? Eleanor answered directly. Clean terms, defined parameters. The confidentiality architecture. How many people are inside it? Eleanor listed names. The board. Margot. Legal. And the scope. Wren's pen stayed exactly where she'd placed it. Does it include deliverables, beyond the announcement, and attendance at the 2 events? Eleanor's pause was brief, half a second, maybe less, but I'd spent 16 years reading pauses in boardrooms, and this one meant she'd anticipated the question and prepared a non-answer. The scope is intentionally flexible to accommodate. That's not an answer. Wren didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Does the scope include anything beyond what's explicitly listed in this document? Another pause. Longer this time. The board reserves the right to request additional appearances, if circumstances. Then I'll need that in writing. With approval requirements. My approval. Wren picked up her pen, the one she'd placed, and uncapped it with a motion that was somehow more decisive than anything Eleanor had done since walking into the room. 1 moment. She wrote at the bottom of the signature page. Block letters, clear and precise, the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who'd learned the hard way what happened when terms weren't documented. Personal decisions made in the context of this engagement require W. Calloway's explicit prior consent. The engagement narrative terminates on her timeline, not the board's. She slid the document back toward Eleanor. The silence that followed was the kind I'd built my career learning to weaponize, the kind where whoever speaks first loses ground. And I watched Eleanor read the clause, watched her expression recalculate, watched her eyes lift to mine with a question she knew better than to ask out loud. I read the clause. I read it again. Something moved through my chest that had nothing to do with optics or shareholder confidence or any framework I'd constructed in the last 16 years of building things that couldn't hurt me. She'd written herself terms. She'd written herself protection. She'd done it in front of me, in front of Eleanor, without apology or explanation. And she'd done it because she'd learned somewhere that if you don't write your own terms, someone else will write them for you. I knew that lesson. I'd built an empire on the scar tissue of learning it. Acceptable, I said. The word came out flatter than I'd intended, the reflex of 16 years of never letting anyone see the machinery, but I saw something shift in Wren's expression. Not surprise. Recognition. Like she'd heard the word I didn't say underneath the word I did. Eleanor, after a beat that said she'd expected an argument, said she would honor the terms. Wren signed. The velvet box had been sitting at the center of the table for the duration of the meeting, and no one had touched it. And when Eleanor gathered the signed pages and excused herself with the self-contained efficiency of a woman who'd accomplished the objective and had 3 more meetings, the box remained. I picked it up. The weight of it was wrong. Too light for what it represented, too small for the architecture it was supposed to support. I'd had Margot source it 3 days ago, after Eleanor's proposal, and I'd given her one instruction: nothing performative. Nothing loud. Something that looked like it had been chosen rather than purchased. I held it out, across the table. Wren looked at my hand, then at my face, then back at the box. She reached out and took it from my fingers, and her skin brushed mine, warm, brief, the kind of contact that shouldn't have registered and registered everywhere, and neither of us acknowledged it. The non-acknowledgement was its own kind of acknowledgement. 10 days, I said, because someone had to say something, and the alternative was standing in silence cataloging the exact temperature of her fingertips. Until the dinner. I know. She put the box in her bag without opening it. I read the schedule. You'll need, I stopped. Started again. If there's anything you need for the event. Logistics, preparation materials, briefings on the attendee list. I've handled hostel rooms before, Mr. Foxwell. The Mr. Foxwell landed like a reminder that this was a contract, that she was a contractor, that whatever had just happened with the brush of fingers across velvet was a variable she'd already decided to exclude from her calculations. I should have let it stand. I should have nodded, said something about Margot coordinating details, walked out of the room, and returned to the Viridian projections waiting on my desk. Instead, I said, Dorian. She looked up. If we're going to be engaged, I said, and the word felt strange in my mouth, heavier than a word should feel, you should probably use my name. Something flickered across her face, too fast to read, gone before I could catalog it, and then she nodded once. Dorian. Testing it. I'll keep that in mind. She left first, which was strategic, which was what I would have done, and I stood in the conference room for a long moment after the door closed, looking at the space where she'd been sitting. The pen she'd used was still on the table. Her pen. The one she'd brought herself, placed deliberately, used to write terms that protected her from a framework she hadn't built. I picked it up. Black ink, serviceable barrel, nothing expensive. The kind of pen someone bought because it worked, not because it impressed. I put it in my jacket pocket. I went back to my office. I did not think about the pen. I thought about the pen, constantly. The announcement ran the next morning across all 3 outlets, exactly as scheduled. Foxwell Technologies CEO confirms engagement to crisis communications consultant, Ren Calloway. The financial press framed it as stabilization. The tech trade ran it as human interest. The Lifestyle Wire used a photo of us from the building's lobby security footage, unauthorized, which meant someone on staff had been paid, that showed me holding a door while she walked through it. I hadn't noticed I was holding the door. I'd been watching her walk. Margot brought me the coverage summary at 7:15 a.m., and I read every piece while standing at my window. And I did not look at the pen sitting on my desk beside my keyboard. And I did not think about the specific curve of Ren's handwriting at the bottom of a contract that bound us together for 60 days. At 9 a.m., I went to her office. She was at her desk, reviewing the Viridian integration communications strategy I'd asked her to assess 3 days ago. And she looked up when I appeared in the doorway, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The announcement ran, I said. I saw. 3 outlets. Clean placement. No unauthorized commentary. I saw that too. I should have left. There was nothing else to say. The announcement had run, the schedule was set, the contract was signed. You didn't open it. The words came out before I decided to say them. The ring. She was quiet for a moment. Then she opened her desk drawer and took out the velvet box and set it on the desk between us. I was going to ask about sizing. Her voice was carefully neutral. Whether I needed to take it somewhere for adjustment. It should fit. The pause that followed was specific. Weighted. How would you know that? Because I'd watched her hands for 4 days. Because I'd cataloged the exact width of her fingers when she held a pen, when she gestured during an argument, when she signed documents with handwriting that looked like it belonged to someone who taught herself to take up space precisely and nothing more. Because I'd given Margot measurements estimated from observation, and told her to find something that wouldn't require adjustment. Lucky guess, I said. Ren opened the box. The ring sat against black velvet. Narrow band, single stone, nothing that would interfere with typing or document handling, nothing that would announce itself across a room. Chosen, not grabbed. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she put it on her left hand. It fit. I watched her notice that it fit. I watched her decide not to comment on the fact that it fit. I watched her close the box and put the empty velvet container back in her drawer and return her attention to the Viridian documents on her desk, and I understood that she'd just filed something about me that she wasn't ready to examine. "The dinner's in 9 days," she said, not looking up. "I'll need the guest list by end of week. Full profiles on anyone likely to approach us. And I'll need to know what the narrative is." The narrative. How we met. How long we've been together. Whether I'm supposed to look at you like I'm in love or like I'm making a strategic calculation. She glanced up then, and her eyes were steady. "Boards prefer the first. Finance reporters will spot the second. Which one are we selling?" I thought about the question longer than I should have. "Both," I said finally. "Depending on who's asking." Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. Acknowledgement. "Then I'll need prep time. The story has to match. Every detail, every date, every explanation for why a crisis communications contractor ended up engaged to a client she's worked with for less than 2 weeks. What story do you want to tell?" The question surprised her. I could see it in the brief widening of her eyes, the moment of recalibration before her expression settled back into professional neutrality. "What story do you want me to tell?" I thought about the truth, that I'd been finding reasons to appear in her doorway for 4 days, that I'd memorized her coffee order and her handwriting and the specific way she held her ground when someone disagreed with her, that the board had handed me a contract that justified proximity I was already engineering, and I'd signed it without hesitation because it meant 60 more days of watching her work. "Tell them whatever you need to," I said. "I'll match it." She nodded once. Returned to her documents. I left. I went back to my office and sat at my desk and looked at the pen I'd taken from the conference room and understood with absolute clarity that I was building something without having named it. The dinner was in 9 days. The announcement was live. The ring was on her finger. And I had 60 days to figure out how to tell her that the story she needed to perform for the room was the one I was already living inside my head.
Chapter 5. Dorian Foxwell.
The acquisition projections filled 3 monitors at midnight. Once, I would have tracked the exact minute. Every figure was precise and confirmed, the kind of numerical certainty I had built my life around trusting, and I had read them 4 times without retaining a single line. The penthouse was silent in the way expensive spaces are silent. Not peaceful. Pressurized. The city 40 floors below moved without me, headlights tracing patterns I couldn't see from this height, lives proceeding according to schedules that had nothing to do with merger timelines or shareholder confidence metrics. I had sent the final Meridian follow-up that morning, reviewed 2 subsidiary reports before noon, cleared a board agenda item by 3. A productive day, by any reasonable measure. The kind of day that should have ended with satisfaction, or at least the absence of active concern. Instead, I could account for the 20 minutes I had spent at my desk at 7 that morning, reading a 3-line email from Ren Calloway about dinner preparation logistics. Talking points attached. "We'll need your approval by Wednesday. See you Thursday." 3 lines. 12 words in the sign-off, if you counted the day of the week as a single unit. I had parsed "see you Thursday" for a register I could not name and could not stop looking for. Professional courtesy? Acknowledgement of obligation? Something that existed in the space between those categories that I had no vocabulary for. The engagement announcement had run that morning in all 3 outlets, her name beside mine in clean authoritative print. Eleanor had sent a single collective reply from the board that read like a relieved exhale. Excellent positioning. Merger timeline holds. Well executed. Well executed. As though Ren were a communications strategy rather than a woman who had looked at the ring I'd given her, put it in her bag without trying it on in front of me, and walked back to her temporary office as though nothing significant had occurred. The optics were working. The merger timeline held. Everything was proceeding according to the architecture I had built. I was sitting in my penthouse at midnight, unable to account for the specific weight a three-word sign-off had placed somewhere behind my sternum. I told myself it was the merger pressure. I had been telling myself that for 11 days, and the number of times I believed it was declining. I went to her temporary office the following morning with a specific, legitimate question about the dinner talking points, the framing on the AI ethics thread, which required a line that wouldn't read as defensive to a room of people who had already formed opinions. She answered it in 40 seconds, returned her eyes to her screen, and typed 2 lines without looking up. The dismissal should have been a relief. Professional efficiency. No wasted time. Exactly the working relationship I cultivated with every contractor, every employee, every person who moved through the architecture of Foxwell Technologies. I asked a second question about tone calibration for the industry journalists who would be present. She answered that too, still without fully turning from the screen, and the answer was correct in a way that made arguing with it impossible. I did not leave. The silence extended by approximately 8 seconds before she looked up from the monitor, her expression carrying the particular quality of someone who had already identified the situation and was deciding how to handle it. Was there something else? There wasn't. I constructed a third question about the sequencing of the evening's talking points, whether the AI ethics framing should proceed or follow the Meridian recovery narrative. I watched recognition move across her face, not slowly, not with any drama, just a clean internal adjustment, the look of someone reading a room correctly and choosing not to announce it. The corner of her mouth shifted, barely, in a direction that was not quite a smile, and not quite anything I had vocabulary for. I left, because staying had become structurally untenable. I walked the 40 feet back to my private elevator and told Margot, without preamble, to add Ren Calloway to the building's internal secure access list. Not the visitor registry, I said. The internal one. Margot's pen paused over her notepad for half a second. Of course. For operational efficiency? Yes. I did not look at her face when she added it. The internal list carried different permissions and different implications. Unrestricted floor access. After-hours building entry. Integration with the security protocols that tracked executive movements. It was the kind of access granted to senior leadership, long-term strategic partners, people whose presence in the building required no explanation or justification. It was not the kind of access granted to 6-month crisis communications contractors. I told myself the engagement made it necessary. Public visibility required practical infrastructure. If photographers caught her entering through the visitor processing system, it would undermine the narrative we were building. Reasonable. Defensible. The kind of explanation that would hold up to board scrutiny if anyone thought to ask. By Friday, I had noticed that Margot had begun briefing Ren on my schedule inflections without instruction. She asked about your Tuesday availability, Margot said when I commented on it. I assumed the access level implied a coordination role. A coordination role. Not a title, not a function, just an implication that had grown from the permission I'd granted without examining why I'd granted it. I let it stand, because correcting it would have required explaining why it was wrong, which I could not do. On Sunday evening, I reviewed the talking points she had submitted for the dinner. They were precisely, specifically correct. Every answer sounded like a person navigating a real conversation rather than a communications team navigating a liability. The AI ethics thread carried genuine complexity without defensiveness. The Meridian recovery narrative acknowledged past failure while demonstrating present competence. The engagement references were minimal, appropriate, exactly calibrated to the audience. I sat with them for longer than review required. At 9:47, I called Margot at home and told her to send Ren a note acknowledging receipt and approval. Then I stopped. The phone stayed in my hand for approximately 30 seconds while I examined the impulse to delegate praise through an intermediary. Standard practice. Professional distance. The kind of buffer that maintained appropriate hierarchies between a CEO and a contractor. I put the phone down, composed 2 words in a direct message, and sent it myself. These work. I sat with the phone afterward in the kind of silence that follows an action taken without full authorization from one's own better judgment. 2 words sent directly to my PR contractor at 10 o'clock on a Sunday night constituted, by any reasonable measure, significant exposure. Not the words themselves. The timing. The directness. The fact that I had chosen to bypass the infrastructure that existed specifically to prevent this kind of unmediated contact. I crossed to the panel beside the cabinetry and pressed the sequence that released the safe door. The small battered box sat where it always sat, tucked beneath a stack of correspondence I had never organized and never thrown away. My mother's letters, her handwriting faded on envelopes that had traveled between a hospital room and a shared apartment I could no longer afford, stacked beneath 3 years of thank you notes from employees, interns, partners, strangers who had been helped by foundation grants or mentorship programs, or the kind of quiet intervention I funded without acknowledgement. Every note I had ever received. None I had ever answered. I looked at the box for a long moment, then closed the safe without opening it. I had been cataloging Wren Calloway the way I cataloged assets I intended to protect. The recruitment brief sat in a file on my personal server, the one Margot didn't manage, the one that contained acquisition research and competitor analysis, and the kind of information that required my direct attention. 6 clients in Brooklyn. 1 assistant named Petra. A consultancy built after a professional dissolution she did not discuss. Revenue projections that suggested competence and vulnerability in equal measure. Enough to survive, not enough to absorb significant disruption. A ring that had fit without being sized. I had read the brief twice before. I was reading it again, scrolling through details that had no bearing on her contract performance, looking for patterns that might explain why she treated me like a person with inconvenient opinions rather than a portfolio with legs. I was sufficiently self-aware to know that what I was calling professional diligence was something else entirely. I was insufficiently equipped to stop. The dinner was in 4 days. I had a role to perform, and a merger to protect, and a framework that accounted for every variable, except the one currently sitting in a temporary office on the 14th floor, sending 3-line emails with sign-offs I was reading for subtext at midnight. I pulled the talking points back up on my screen. Read them again, looking for something I might have missed. Found nothing, except the submission timestamp at the bottom of the document. See you Thursday. I recognized, with the specific cold clarity of a man who had never lost anything he was paying sufficient attention to, that I had already crossed a threshold. Not the threshold of wanting her. That had happened in the conference room on day 1, when she told me I was wrong about the audit timeline and explained exactly why, and I'd watched her build an argument with her hands and understood that I was in significant trouble. The threshold I'd crossed was different. Less defensible. More dangerous. I had moved from managing this situation to being inside it. The crossing had happened quietly, incrementally, in the space of 40-second answers and corners of mouths that were not quite smiles. There was no single moment I could point to and call the mistake. No decision I could reverse, no action I could undo. I had simply been present, paying attention, and somewhere in that attention the professional justification had hollowed out and left something I didn't have a framework for. I closed the file. I did not sleep for another 2 hours. Thursday arrived with the precision of things that cannot be delayed. The Aldrin Center was midtown formal, the kind of venue designed to make money feel earned and taste feel cultivated. I had attended 6 events here in the past 3 years. 2 of them had produced partnerships worth 8 figures. 1 had produced a betrayal I'd cataloged and addressed through subsequent leverage. I knew every angle of the lobby, every sightline from the main entrance, every vantage point from which a photographer might capture the kind of moment that ends up in trade publications and shareholder reports. When I crossed the threshold at 7:42, exactly 8 minutes after the scheduled arrival to establish presence without appearing eager, I saw her immediately. Wren stood at the entrance in a green dress I recognized from her consultancy's website photo. Not new. Not assembled for this room. She had not borrowed jewelry, had not arranged herself for the kind of assessment that accompanied events at this level. She was just herself, in a space full of people who had dressed specifically to be seen by me. The realization landed somewhere beneath my sternum and stayed there. Every person in that room who watched me look at her would read the look correctly. I knew this with the same diagnostic precision I applied to quarterly projections and competitive analysis. I had no architecture left to prevent it. I crossed the lobby. The distance between us closed in approximately 12 seconds, each step confirming what I already understood. I was walking towards something I could not calculate my way out of, and I was doing it anyway, because the alternative, standing still, maintaining distance, treating this as the professional arrangement it was contractually defined to be, had become impossible somewhere in the past 11 days without my consent or awareness. She watched me approach without adjusting her expression. "Mr. Foxwell," she said, and the formality landed like a test I wasn't certain I was passing. Wren. Her name felt different in my mouth than any name had felt in years. Too familiar. Too deliberate. The talking points were excellent. I know. The corner of her mouth shifted, barely, in that direction I still didn't have vocabulary for. I extended my arm in the manner the photographs would require, and she took it in the manner the engagement would demand. And we walked into a room full of people who would spend the next 3 hours watching us perform a story that had stopped being performance somewhere around day 4. I didn't know how to name what had replaced it. I was beginning to suspect that naming it wasn't the point.
Chapter 6. Dorian Foxwell.
The Aldrin Center ballroom held 300 people, and I had stopped seeing any of them. Wren stood near the entrance in a green dress that had no business doing what it did to my concentration. Not new, I noted. The hem showed the particular softness of fabric that had been worn before, cleaned well, chosen deliberately. She hadn't borrowed anything for tonight. Hadn't asked for anything. The ring on her finger caught the light as she adjusted her clutch, and I watched her scan the room the way she scanned everything, systematically, professionally, cataloging threat and opportunity with the same practiced efficiency I used in acquisition meetings. I had been standing near the seating chart for 4 minutes, which was 3 minutes and 50 seconds longer than necessary. Mr. Foxwell, the event coordinator, appeared at my elbow with a clipboard. "Your table is ready whenever you'd like to be seated." "Not yet." She nodded and retreated. I crossed the lobby toward Wren, watching her register my approach without turning, the subtle shift in her shoulders, the way her grip on the clutch relaxed a fraction of an inch. She'd known I was there before I moved. "You're early," I said. "You're watching the door." I was reviewing the seating arrangement. Her mouth curved just barely. "For 4 minutes. Damn." She'd clocked me too. The photographers, stationed near the entrance, had already taken 3 shots of us standing 6 feet apart, which would read as anticipation in tomorrow's coverage. I closed the distance and offered my hand. Not a handshake, something that would photograph correctly. Her fingers slid against my palm, cool and steady, and I guided her hand to rest in the crook of my elbow as we turned toward the ballroom. "The talking points," I said, low enough that only she could hear. "You revised the meridian section." The original framing was defensive. I shifted it to forward-looking. I noticed. I know. 300 people, and the only voice I could hear clearly was hers. The ballroom opened before us in tiers of white linen and crystal, the kind of deliberate opulence that telegraphed industry importance without crossing into vulgarity. I guided Wren through the clusters of early arrivals, nodding at faces I recognized, calculating the conversations I would need to have and the ones I could defer. My hand stayed at her back. Professional proximity, event-appropriate contact, nothing that exceeded the parameters of the arrangement. The warmth of her through the fabric of her dress made professional proximity feel like a lie I was telling myself. Our table sat near the front, 12 seats occupied by board members, tech founders whose names appeared in Meridian coverage, and one empty chair that I knew would be filled before the first course. Eleanor had confirmed the guest list personally. Every placement served a purpose. I pulled out Ren's chair before the server could reach us. She sat with the particular grace of someone who had learned to occupy space efficiently, without apology or excess. The journalist seated to her left, Okafor, according to the place card, turned immediately with the eager attention of someone who had already researched her. Ren Calloway. I read your Meridian reframe in the trade coverage. Impressive pivot. Thank you. The timeline acknowledgement without commitment was elegant. Most crisis teams either overcommit or stonewall. Ren's posture shifted subtly, not performance but genuine engagement. The original statement created the timeline problem. The reframe had to address accountability without inheriting the liability. I should have been listening to the VP on my right, who was saying something about Q3 projections. Instead, I was watching Ren explain media architecture to a journalist who was taking notes on his phone, her hands moving in the precise gestures she used when building an argument. The same gestures I had tracked in my conference room 3 weeks ago when she told me I was wrong about the audit timeline. She had been right. I had known it within 30 seconds of her explanation. I had hired her within 30 seconds after that. The first course arrived, some arrangement of greens and goat cheese that I moved around the plate without eating. Ren and Okafor had progressed from Meridian to a broader conversation about the consolidation of trade press into generalist verticals, and I found myself cataloging the specific way she disagreed with him, directly, without apology, offering evidence rather than opinion. The consolidation argument assumes advertising revenue is the primary driver, she said. But the actual pressure comes from platform distribution. When LinkedIn became a primary discovery channel for B2B content, it changed what trade publications could sustain. That's a content argument, not a revenue argument. They're the same argument. Content that doesn't distribute doesn't generate revenue. The consolidation follows the distribution. Okafor made a note. I'd like to quote you on that. Off the record for tonight. Call my office next week. She handled him perfectly. Professional courtesy, clear boundaries, the kind of media management that most executives never learned because they were too busy being defensive. I should have been making conversation with the logistics VP. Instead, I was watching Ren operate and understanding with uncomfortable clarity that I had been looking for excuses to be in the same room with her for 2 weeks and calling it professional oversight. The second course arrived. Ren turned briefly to acknowledge it, and our eyes met across the 6 inches of space between our chairs. The engagement ring caught the candlelight. You're not eating, she said, quiet enough that the table noise covered it. Neither are you. I'm working. So am I. Her mouth curved again, that precise, controlled expression that wasn't quite a smile but lived somewhere adjacent. Are you? Before I could answer, Fen Harwick materialized at Ren's other side. He was broad-shouldered and aggressively sociable, the kind of industry presence who believed his own press and assumed everyone else did too. I had known Harwick for 6 years. I had been reconsidering the March partnership extension for 4 of them. Ren Calloway. His voice stayed just below the register of public conversation, intimate enough to exclude the table, loud enough that I could hear every word. I've been hearing your name in interesting circles. Ren set down her fork. Mr. Harwick. Fen, please. He leaned closer than necessary. I have to ask, how'd a boutique PR girl land the Foxwell contract? Who'd you know? I was moving before the question finished landing. Fen. My voice didn't rise. It dropped. I've been reconsidering the partnership extension we discussed in March. I'll have my office confirm the updated terms tomorrow. Harwick went still. I watched the calculation cross his face, the specific way he was recalibrating what my statement meant for the revenue projections he'd been counting on for 3 quarters. That's not. We're done here. He left. Not dramatically. Not with any scene that the 300 observers in this room could report as conflict. Just the quiet retreat of a man who understood that I had closed a door and that I would not be reopening it. I turned to the nearest server. Still water. Immediately. The server retrieved a glass from the service station and placed it in my hand within 12 seconds. I set it in front of Ren without comment. She looked at the glass. Then at me. Her expression was the particular unreadable thing I had been trying to decode for 2 weeks. Not surprised, not grateful, something closer to assessment. 3 weeks ago, she said very quietly. The conference room. I mentioned preferring still water. Yes. You remembered. Yes. She picked up the glass and took a measured sip, and I understood that I had just done something that could not be explained by professional oversight or event logistics or any of the frameworks I had been using to justify my behavior. I had remembered a detail she mentioned once in passing, and I had acted on it without thinking, because acting on it felt correct in a way I couldn't articulate. The board members 2 seats down were watching. The journalist was watching. Eleanor, at the far end of the table, was watching with the particular expression of someone cataloging data for future use. I returned to my seat and did not look at Ren again for the remainder of the meal. This was a lie. I looked at her constantly. In the peripheral vision I had spent 39 years learning to weaponize, in the spaces between conversations that required my direct attention, in the particular way my body oriented toward her presence even when my face pointed elsewhere. After dessert, I guided her through the exit process with the efficiency of someone who had attended 300 events exactly like this one. Photographs at the lobby, brief acknowledgments to departing board members, Eleanor's small nod that meant the evening had gone according to plan. In the car, I sat on the opposite side of the seat and watched the city scroll past the window. Ren said nothing. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was something else, something I didn't have a word for. The kind of quiet that existed between people who had witnessed something together and were still processing what it meant. 4 blocks passed. 5. Harwick, she said finally. What about him? That was the March extension. The logistics partnership your board approved in Q1. You read the coverage. It was a significant revenue projection. Yes. 6 blocks. 7. You didn't have to do that. I turned to look at her. The streetlights moved across her face in intervals, shadow, light, shadow again. The ring on her finger glinted once and went dark. Yes, I said. I did. She didn't argue. She didn't thank me. She turned back to the window and watched the city pass, and I sat with the specific weight of having done something that had no professional justification and could not be explained by any framework I had built. The car stopped at her building. She reached for the door handle and paused. The access list, she said without turning. Margot mentioned it. What about it? The timestamp was 3 days ago. Before tonight. I said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make this worse. She opened the door and stepped onto the curb. I watched her walk to the lobby entrance, watched her badge through the security panel, watched the door close behind her. I didn't tell the driver to move until she was out of sight. In my penthouse at midnight, I stood at the window and looked at the city I had spent 15 years learning to own. The safe behind the panel held my mother's letters, the thank you notes I had never answered, the structure of everything I protected. I had terminated a partnership worth significant quarterly revenue because Fen Harwick called her a boutique PR girl in a tone I didn't like. I had added her to the internal access list 3 days before any professional framework required it. I had remembered that she preferred still water from one comment in one meeting, and I had acted on the memory without conscious thought. The frameworks I had built did not account for any of this. I opened my phone. The security notification from 3 days ago was still in my inbox. Confirmation that I had added a contractor to employee-level access without any documentation that would justify the decision. She would have seen the timestamp by now. She would be cataloging it the way she cataloged everything, fitting it into whatever framework she was using to understand what this arrangement had become. I closed the phone and did not look at it again. The city spread below me, lit and moving and indifferent, and I stood at the glass and understood that I had been building something without naming it for 2 weeks, and that Wren Calloway had already started taking it apart.
Chapter 7. Dorian Foxwell.
The acquisition clause had not changed between my third and fourth readings of it, which meant the problem was not the clause. I set the document down on my desk at 6:14 in the morning and looked at the city below, still pre-dawn gray, the glass giving back my own reflection more than the skyline, and admitted to myself, with the particular precision I applied to things I did not want to admit, that I had been sitting in this chair for 70 minutes thinking about the way Wren Calloway had looked at me in the backseat of the car. Not grateful. Not rattled. Cataloging. As though I were a variable she had not yet assigned a value to, and she was in no hurry to assign one, and the not assigning was something I could not account for in any framework I trusted. I had reviewed the security access log on my phone at 11:52 the previous night. Habit, I told myself, routine system confirmation, and seen her name sitting in the internal employee list where I had placed it 3 days prior, the timestamp a quiet record of a decision I had made before any professional logic required it. I had not examined that decision at the time. I examined it now, in the early gray of my office, with the acquisition clause sitting unread on the desk, and reached the conclusion that I had made it because I had wanted to, which was not a sufficient reason and was the only reason there was. The city lightened by degrees outside the glass. I picked up the clause again. I did not read it. My pen rolled between my fingers, an old habit, something to occupy the hands while the mind worked through a problem it did not want to name. The problem had dark hair, and a way of looking at me like I was a particularly stubborn equation she intended to solve on her own timeline. Van Harwick's face kept surfacing. The way his eyes had narrowed when I informed him the partnership extension was under reconsideration. The $12.7 million in projected revenue I had put at risk because he had leaned too close to her and spoken in a register that made my hands want to do something inadvisable. I had told myself in the car afterward that it was about professional boundaries, about maintaining standards for how contractors were treated in my presence, about the optics of permitting disrespect at a public event. I had not been thinking about optics when I did it. I had been thinking about the specific shade of composure on her face when Harwick opened his mouth. The way she had not flinched, had simply begun to respond cool and competent. And the way something in me had decided that she should not have to finish that sentence, that I would finish it for her, that I would end the entire conversation with 4 words and let Harwick work out the mathematics of what crossing me would cost. The pen stilled between my fingers. I did not do things like that. I made calculated moves with documented reasoning and projected outcomes. I did not burn bridges worth $12 million because someone spoke to a woman in a tone I did not like. Except, apparently, I did. The sun crested the eastern edge of the skyline, painting the glass gold, and I pushed back from my desk and accepted the morning's first clear thought. I was going to go downstairs to her office and find a reason to stay there, and the reason would be professional, and it would also be a lie. At 9 o'clock, I appeared in the doorway of Wren's temporary office with a question about the charity auction talking points, specifically whether the framing around Foxwell's philanthropic giving should lead with the AI literacy initiative or the infrastructure grants, given the donor composition of the room. It was a legitimate question. I was aware that it was also the first question that had come to me when I stood up from my desk and decided, without examining the decision, to walk down 2 floors. Ren looked up from her monitor without surprise, which itself was notable. My staff did not receive my unannounced arrivals without some visible adjustment. The corner of her mouth did not quite curve, but something shifted in the set of her jaw that suggested she had expected me, or at least had not ruled out the possibility. "The literacy initiative," she said before I finished asking. "Unless you want the room to read you as defensive." I stepped into the doorway frame. The infrastructure grants represent larger numbers. The board will be watching the coverage. The board is watching the merger optics. She turned slightly in her chair, giving me a fraction more of her attention. The morning light caught the edge of the ring on her finger, the ring I had placed there, the one that fit without being sized, the detail I had not examined because examining it would require admitting things I was not prepared to admit. The merger's resistance is coming from the AI regulation space. The room you're walking into contains a keynote speaker who spent 4 years covering that beat. She'll remember what you choose to lead with. She'll remember the gift amount. No. Ren's eyes held mine, steady, certain, entirely unimpressed by my position or my money or the fact that I signed her contract. She'll remember the story you told. The infrastructure grants are a number. The literacy initiative is a direction. The number that matters isn't the gift amount, it's who's in the room when you say it. I listened to the full argument. 4 sentences, each one landing with the precision of someone who understood exactly what she was saying and had no intention of softening it. I had built a $12 billion company on my ability to identify when I was wrong. The skill required admitting it, which I was reasonably good at, and changing course, which I was excellent at. What I was not good at was the specific sensation of having someone look at me the way she was looking at me now, as though my title and my net worth were irrelevant to the conversation we were actually having. "Literacy initiative," I said. "I'll tell Margot." I did not leave. I should have left. The question was answered. The business concluded. There was no professional reason to remain standing in her doorway watching her return to her monitor, watching the way her pen moved across the margin of the document she was reviewing. Small handwriting, precise, something that was not a Foxwell document. Was there something else? Her voice carried the faint edge of someone who had noticed me noticing. "The Viridian rollout," I said. "Subsidiary rebrand. I want your read." The pause she gave me was not surprised. It was the pause of someone who had noted that this fell outside her contract scope and had chosen, for reasons she did not articulate, to answer anyway. She put down her pen. She swiveled her chair to face me fully, and I saw her catalog me with the same careful attention she had given the acquisition documents, the talking points, every problem I had placed in front of her. "The name is a problem," she said. "It's a strong brand. Established market presence. It shares syllable structure with Meridian." She let that sit for a moment, watching me process it. "The press will notice. You've just spent 2 weeks cleaning up a data breach narrative. You don't want the rebrand announcement to trigger association with the crisis you've moved past." I had not noticed the phonetic similarity. I noticed it now, and the recognition landed with the particular discomfort of having been outthought. "And the timing. Announce alongside a product milestone, not alone. You want the coverage anchor to be performance, not optics. Give them a number to talk about, and the name becomes secondary. 15 minutes. No notes. 2 recommendations that would require me to restructure the timeline I had already approved with the board. I took both. I left her office, and 3 steps down the corridor, I realized I had forgotten what I was supposed to be doing for the next hour, which was a problem because I had a standing acquisition call at 10, and the acquisition clause I had failed to read was still sitting on my desk. That evening, we reviewed the charity auction talking points in the small conference room she had claimed on day 2, not my office, not the boardroom, the room she had arranged to function rather than impress. Printouts covered the table. A whiteboard she had commandeered from the supply corridor held a media cycle timeline in her handwriting. The space smelled like dry erase markers, and the coffee she had been drinking for the past 3 hours, dark roast, no sugar. I knew how she took her coffee. I knew she preferred still water. I knew she checked her phone exactly twice per hour, never more, and that she wrote margin notes in blue ink rather than black, and that when she was building an argument she used her hands, precise gestures, controlled, nothing wasted. I knew these things because I had been watching her for 6 weeks. The knowledge sat in my chest like evidence of something I was not prepared to prosecute. "The second question needs a pivot point," she said, marking up the draft in front of her. "If the journalist goes straight to regulatory concerns, you don't want to be caught defending. Better to redirect to application. What the technology does for students, not what the government does to the technology." "Agreed." She looked up, pen pausing. "You're agreeing with me a lot tonight. You're correct a lot tonight." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, the kind of thing that lived in the space between professional composure and something else. "Don't let it become a habit. I'll get complacent." "I doubt that." The words came out lower than I intended, rougher, and I watched her register the tone change, watched her file it somewhere I could not access. We had been working for 40 minutes when she said, without looking up from the marked draft in her hand, "We could just admit to the room that we rehearsed this and charge consulting fees for the meta-performance." I almost smiled. I felt it happen, a loosening at the corner of my mouth, a reflex toward warmth that my discipline had not anticipated, and I caught it and disciplined it back before it fully arrived, but not before she saw it. I knew she saw it because she did not say anything, which was the tell. Wren Calloway responded to most things. When she chose not to respond, it was because she was filing something. The silence stretched. The fluorescent hum of the overhead lights. The distant sound of the building's HVAC cycling. The specific quality of the air between two people who had noticed something and were pretending they had not. I gathered the draft pages. The donor arrival sequence. Adjust it so the tech founders enter before the keynote introduction. I want her attention on the room composition, not the door. Done. 4 words. Professional. Conclusive. I left, and the almost smile stayed in the room after me, present in the air the way a sound continues briefly after its source is gone. I was aware, walking down the corridor toward the elevator, of having left it there deliberately. I sat in the back of my car for 12 minutes going nowhere. Driver idling in the garage, engine quiet, the city's ambient pressure reduced to a murmur outside the tinted glass, before I said without preamble, "Home," and the car moved. I opened the internal access log on my phone. Wren's name was there. 3 days before the dinner. My authorization. My decision. I had told myself at the time that it was administrative efficiency. She would need building access for the event preparations. The temporary badge system was cumbersome, the internal list was faster. A logical progression of operational requirements. I closed the app. The car moved through Midtown, streets slicking with the beginning of evening rain, and I stared at the dark shape of my phone screen and admitted the thing I had been avoiding. I was building something without having named it. The not naming was intentional. Naming it would require examining the architecture. Examining the architecture would require confronting the fact that the foundation was not operational logic. It was want, which was a material I had not used in construction before and did not fully trust under load. I wanted her. Not the engagement performance. Not the crisis communications work. Not the professional arrangement that the board had authorized and the contract specified. Her. The way she looked at me like I was a problem worth solving. The way she argued back without flinching. The way she had sat in that conference room, making dark jokes about meta-performance, and the way my face had tried to do something it hadn't done in years, smile without permission, without strategy, without knowing what the smile would cost. The penthouse elevator opened onto silence, and the specific quality of air that came from living alone in too much space. I loosened my tie, and walked to the window and looked at Midtown and did not turn on any lights. My phone buzzed. Calendar notification. I opened it. The charity auction was 22 days out. Eleanor had scheduled a board check-in for the following Thursday. Agenda line item reading Optics Progress Assessment, which was the institutional language for show us the return on the strategy we authorized. I had not told Eleanor that somewhere in the past week, the engagement had stopped being a strategy in my mind. I did not have vocabulary for what it had become instead. It lived in the space between the almost smile and her name on the access list and 4 sentences that made me reconsider a decision I had already made. It lived in the way I had stood in her doorway this morning with a question I already knew the answer to, just to hear her answer it differently than I expected. Optics progress was no longer an accurate description of what I was measuring. I closed the app and set the phone on the counter and stood at the window and watched the city darken and admitted, finally, with the kind of precision I usually reserve for contracts and acquisitions and things that could be documented. I was in trouble.
Chapter 8. Dorian Foxwell.
By the 3rd week, the distinction between performance and reality had begun to erode. The charity auction occupied a Midtown gallery that had been designed to make wealth feel like culture. White walls, strategic lighting, art that cost more than most people's homes, arranged at intervals that said, "Look but don't touch." I had been to dozens of events in this building. I had never once thought about the lighting until tonight, when I found myself calculating which angles would photograph Ren best, and then catching myself doing it. She stood beside me at the entrance while the hired photographers captured exactly what they'd been paid to capture. 2 people arriving together, my hand at the small of her back, the frame flattering both the building's glass facade and whatever narrative Eleanor had constructed for the shareholders. The engagement addendum ended tonight. 2 events, defined term, clean scope. I had read the contract. I knew the parameters. My hand stayed where it was. Ren didn't stiffen at the contact. I had expected her to. Some small tell that would remind me this was performance, that the warmth of her skin through the fabric of her dress was incidental, that the way she leaned slightly into the pressure was operational. She did none of those things. She walked into the room like she belonged there, and I followed because I had stopped being able to do anything else. The table seated 12. I had reviewed the placement 3 times before arriving and changed nothing, which meant I had approved putting Elaine Corey, board adjacent, and my last public relationship, 2 seats from my left. Eleanor's decision. Optics, probably. The ex-girlfriend and the current fiancé in the same frame, demonstrating that Dorian Foxwell was capable of civilized transitions. I had agreed to it, because agreeing was simpler than explaining why I would have preferred Elaine in a different building entirely. Ren took her seat and began cataloging the room the way she always did, quick, efficient, the assessment of someone who had learned to read hostile territory before it read her. I watched her note the board members, the 2 founders I'd placed as strategic buffers, the careful geometry of who had been seated near whom. When her gaze landed on Elaine, it stayed for exactly 2 seconds before moving on. I sat down beside her and did not think about the specific way her shoulder almost touched mine. The first course arrived, and the table performed itself. Board members spoke in the register of people accustomed to being listened to. The founders deferred strategically. I sat in the center of it and said nothing, because the room already knew I was there, and my silence was its own kind of statement. Elaine had not acknowledged Ren directly for the first 40 minutes. I recognized the technique, the deliberate pause before engagement, the positioning that said, "I am deciding when to notice you." I had seen her use it in dozens of rooms over the 2 years we'd been together. I had never particularly cared about its target before. When Elaine finally leaned across the table, her voice pitched for apparent warmth, I heard every word even though they weren't directed at me. "I hope you know what you're signing up for." Elaine's smile was precisely placed, exactly right for the room. "He's very good at needing nothing from people." Ren didn't pause. "That makes 2 of us." The words landed clean, too honest, not strategic, and I went still in a way I hadn't gone still in years. Beside me, Ren picked up her water glass like the conversation was over, and it was because she had ended it. She didn't look at me. She held Elaine's gaze, level, unhurried, and then turned to the founder on her right and asked him something about logistics infrastructure that was apparently a real question, because he answered it for the next 6 minutes while I sat there processing the specific weight of what she'd said. That makes two of us. I had spent 15 years building a company on the principle that needing nothing from anyone was the only defensible position. I had watched relationships end because the women I'd chosen eventually wanted something I couldn't identify, couldn't name, couldn't produce on demand. I had told myself the pattern was evidence of incompatibility, not failure. I had believed it. Ren Calloway had just announced to a room full of people who were watching me that she operated on the same principle, and instead of feeling understood, I felt something crack open in my chest that I did not have accurate language for. Elaine repositioned, smoothly, without visible cost, pivoting to questions about Calloway communications that sounded like professional interest and functioned as structural audits. Client model. Expansion plans. The specific vulnerabilities of boutique operations. I listened to Ren answer each question with exactly the information it warranted, and nothing more, and I understood that she had been navigating rooms like this one since long before I'd hired her. She didn't need me to intervene. She didn't need me at all. The realization should have been a relief. It was not. Across the table, Eleanor Stave caught Ren's eye after Elaine's third question and gave her a look that lasted half a second. Good, you're useful. The institutional acknowledgement of a component performing its function. I watched Ren's face stay pleasantly neutral, and I knew she had read the look correctly, and I knew she had filed it somewhere that would inform how she dealt with Eleanor going forward. The dinner continued. Ren held her own the way she always did, not by performing for the room but by being present in it, turning toward conversations that interested her, asking questions that were real questions. I was aware of the table tracking me, tracking her. I was aware that this awareness was becoming a problem I did not have a clean solution to. When the dessert plates were cleared, and the room began its slow dissolution into standing conversations and strategic exits, I guided Ren toward the coat check with my hand still at her back. We had not spoken directly to each other for the past hour. We had not needed to. The silence between us had been its own kind of communication, and I was choosing not to examine what it had communicated. The car was waiting at the curb. I opened her door. She slid in. I followed. The driver pulled into traffic, and neither of us spoke. The city scrolled past the window. Lights, movement, the ordinary chaos of a Tuesday night in Manhattan, and the silence in the back seat was not uncomfortable. It was heavy with something neither of us was saying. That's not entirely true, I said finally, the words coming out before I had decided to speak them. About needing nothing. She didn't turn from the window immediately. I watched her profile in the passing streetlight, the line of her jaw, the way her shoulders held still. No, she said eventually. Not entirely. The admission cost both of us something. I could feel it in the air between us, the shift from performance to something that had no contract, no defined term, no clean scope. The car pulled to the curb outside my building. Neither of us moved. The driver waited. The engine idled. The doorman stood at the entrance pretending not to watch. Ren. She turned from the window. Her eyes met mine, and I saw the calculation happening, the same calculation I was running. The assessment of risk versus want versus the specific danger of what came next. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. We rode the private elevator to the penthouse in silence. When the doors opened, I didn't reach for the lights. The city was visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Manhattan spread out below, indifferent and enormous, and she walked toward it without hesitation, stopping at the glass like she was taking inventory of something vast. I followed. I came up behind her, my hands settling on her hips, her back against my chest. She was warm through the fabric of her dress, and she didn't stiffen, didn't pull away. She leaned into me, the way she had at the entrance to the gallery, and I stopped pretending this was operational. "Tell me this is what you want." My voice came out low, rough in a way I hadn't heard from myself in years. "Ask me to stop, and I stop." She turned to face me in the dark, her hands finding my jacket, pulling it off my shoulders with a deliberateness that was its own kind of answer. I kissed her then, finally, after weeks of almost smiles and doorway appearances and the specific torture of proximity without contact. She tasted like champagne and something sharper, something that was just her, and I pressed her back against the glass and felt her exhale against my mouth. Her hands worked at my shirt buttons while I found the zipper at the back of her dress. The fabric slid down her shoulders, pooled at her waist, and I pulled back to look at her, green dress half gone, skin flushed in the ambient light of the city, her eyes watching me watch her. "You've been staring at me since the first meeting," she said, her voice steadier than mine would have been. "Longer." I pulled the dress the rest of the way down, let it fall to the floor. "Since the first meeting." I noticed. "I know." I lifted her wrists above her head, pinned them against the glass with one hand. She could have pulled free. I wasn't holding her tight enough to trap her, just tight enough to feel, and she didn't. She arched into me instead, her breath catching when my mouth found the curve of her neck. "Dorian." My name in her voice. Not a question. An instruction. I swept her into my arms and carried her to the couch. Everything after that was a blur of motion, and the specific sounds she made, the territory I'd been imagining for weeks, finally becoming real. I let go of the control I'd been maintaining all night, matching her rhythm, until the world finally shattered with her name on my lips, and the absolute certainty that this had changed everything. We lay there afterward, tangled on the couch, the city still visible through the windows. Neither of us spoke. The silence was different now, not heavy with what we weren't saying, but full of what we'd said with our bodies. She moved first. Sat up, found her dress on the floor, pulled it back on with the efficient movements of someone who had always known she would be the one to leave. I watched her. I didn't ask her to stay. She crossed to the elevator and pressed the button. The doors opened. "The addendum ended tonight," she said, not turning around. "I know." "So this wasn't?" "No." I sat up, met her eyes. "This wasn't that." She nodded once. Stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. I sat in the dark for a long time after she left, trying to reconstruct the architecture of a contract that no longer existed, trying to name the thing that had replaced it. The engagement addendum was over. The crisis communications contract continued. Neither of those frameworks accounted for what had just happened. I didn't know what the next step was. I had always known the next step. For the first time in 15 years, I was building something without a blueprint, and the absence of structure should have been terrifying. It wasn't. It was something closer to hope.
Chapter 9. Dorian Foxwell.
The board call began at 7, and I controlled every minute of it until Eleanor Stave asked, in her measured institutional register, whether the optics engagement had formally concluded. I let the question sit for exactly 3 seconds before responding. The addendum term had elapsed. The charity auction was documented. The box was ticked. I told her the parameters were under review, which was not a lie and was not the truth. And it bought me exactly nothing, except the 12 seconds it took Eleanor to say that the Viridian merger closed in 30 days and stable optics through the closing window was non-negotiable. I ended the call at the 50-minute mark. No one on my board had ever witnessed that before. I heard the silence of their unmuted lines in the half-second before I disconnected, the quiet of people recalibrating what they thought they knew about Dorian Foxwell's patterns. My office held the aftermath of the call like a pressure differential. Glass walls unchanged. City unchanged. 41 floors of Foxwell Technologies below me, proceeding at their ordinary velocity. I sat with the board memo still open on my screen, and understood that what I was about to do had nothing to do with Eleanor Stave's closing window. I was already reaching for my jacket. The previous night's document, the one that had arrived in an untraced inbox, sat at the edge of my awareness like a problem I had elected not to solve before I had to. I noted the election. I did not correct it. Not yet. I took the stairs to her floor because the private elevator felt too deliberate, too much like an announcement. Found her at her desk in the temporary office at the east end of the floor, morning light coming hard through the window behind her, turning her into a kind of silhouette I had to wait a beat to resolve. She looked up when I stepped into the doorway. I saw it immediately, the thing I had been watching develop in her expression over the past few weeks. The precise calibration of someone who already knew what was coming and had decided how they were going to handle it. She knew the addendum term had elapsed. She'd known before my call ended. I crossed to the chair across from her desk and sat, which was not a thing I usually did in subordinate offices. She watched me do it with the particular stillness she kept for moments when she was deciding something. The Meridian follow-up cycle runs through the end of your contract term, I said. 6 months. We're at week 6. Yes. The syllable had weight. I placed my hands flat on her desk, not reaching for the pen I usually rolled between my fingers, not filling the space with motion, and said, "The board wants to extend the appearance schedule. One more event. A foundation dinner 4 weeks from now." She was quiet for a moment that I measured against my own pulse, which was behaving badly. "Then, is this Eleanor's request or yours?" I didn't answer immediately, and the pause did what silences between us always did. It told her everything the words would have softened. She held my gaze for 2 more seconds, then opened the center drawer of her desk and removed the addendum contract. The physical copy. My signature on page 3. Her signature beneath it. She placed it on the desk between us, with the deliberate calm of someone who had thought this through before I arrived. "I'm going to need a new clause," she said. "Not board language. Yours. If there's a third event, I want to know your reason for it. In writing. In your words." I looked at the contract. I looked at her. The morning light was still coming hard through the window, and she was watching me with the expression that had been dismantling my capacity for efficient thought since week 1. Unreadable, precise, asking nothing, and therefore impossible to deflect. I reached across the desk and picked up the pen from the edge of her notepad. Uncapped it. Wrote 7 words in the margin of the addendum's final page, in my handwriting, which was angular and controlled and looked nothing like a confession. "I want you there." I set the pen down. She pulled the contract toward her and read it, and I watched her read it, and the room was completely quiet in the way that rooms were quiet when something was being decided that could not be undecided. She didn't look up immediately. When she did, her expression had shifted into something I couldn't name. Not warmth, not the careful professional register she used in front of my board, something underneath both of those. "I'll go to the dinner," she said. "Not as a component. As a choice." "I know the difference," I said. She almost believed me. I could see the almost, the precise millimeter of distance between her belief and its absence, and I understood that I had put that distance there, that closing it was going to require more than 7 words in a contract margin. I was still working out the architecture of what more looked like. "The Viridian rebrand materials," she said, shifting the conversation back to solid ground. "You wanted my read on the subsidiary rollout." I did. "I sent the analysis last night. You didn't respond." I was occupied. Her eyebrow lifted a fraction. "With the board?" "No." The single syllable hung between us. We both knew what I'd been occupied with. What had happened in my penthouse after the charity auction. What had changed between us in ways neither of us had named yet. She looked at me for a long moment, then pulled a file from the stack on her desk. "The rebrand timeline has a gap. Your communications team scheduled the press embargo lift for the same day as the Viridian regulatory filing. That's a mistake. Why? Because when the filing goes public, the financial press will lead with that story. Your rebrand announcement will get buried below the fold. You want to announce 3 days earlier. Give the trade publications time to run features, then let the regulatory story confirm the momentum. I absorbed this. She was right. My VP of Communications had been running on institutional autopilot for 8 months, and I had let him because I'd been focused on acquisition mechanics rather than narrative architecture. Implement it, I said. That's outside my contract scope. I'm aware. You're asking me to do work I wasn't hired for. I'm asking you to do work you're better at than anyone else in this building. She held my gaze. Something shifted in the air between us, not tension exactly. Recognition. The specific weight of being seen for what you are and having that be enough. Fine, she said. But I'm billing separately. Bill whatever you want. She almost smiled. Caught it. Disciplined it back. But I saw the edge of it, the way her mouth shifted before she recovered, and that fraction of movement stayed with me as I left her office. I went back to the 41st floor and stood at my desk without sitting. The Viridian acquisition timeline from the prior week's update sat open on my second monitor. I reviewed it for the third time and realized I had not once in 3 days thought about the merger in terms of what its close required from Ren. I had been thinking about it as a closing I wanted to handle well. A negotiation I intended to win cleanly. The kind of outcome that would matter in 5 years. The board's optics architecture had existed in an entirely separate column of my thinking, the way certain costs were allocated to lines that never appeared in the annual report. The document was the problem. Not the document I'd written 7 words on. The other one. The one I had not yet told her about. Every hour I did not tell her was a decision in itself. The kind I recognize from boardrooms as the moment a problem stops being manageable and starts being definitive. I pulled up my email. Eleanor's follow-up had arrived at 9:47 a.m. Subject line, Viridian Integration, Optics Architecture, Status Review. I opened it because I had not yet learned to leave Eleanor's messages unread. Page 1 was standard. Merger timeline. Regulatory checkpoints. Shareholder communication schedule. Page 2 detailed the foundation dinner, suggested attendance list, seating arrangement, press opportunities. Page 3. I stopped. The section was dated 4 months prior. Before the recruiter's call. Before the contract. Before Ren had any reason to know Foxwell Technologies existed. The header read, Image Stabilization Strategy, Precondition Analysis. I read the first paragraph. Read it again. The strategy outlined the optics problem, my pattern of failed relationships, the tabloid coverage, the shareholder concerns, and proposed a solution. A public-facing engagement with a credible professional presence. Defined term. Clean exit. Minimal reputational risk. The second paragraph described the ideal candidate profile. Boutique crisis PR. Recently available. Credibly independent. Someone whose professional circumstances made a lucrative contract attractive without requiring explanation. The third paragraph contained the line that made my chest tighten. Asset to be sourced through third-party placement to maintain contractual insulation from strategic architecture. I closed my eyes. She hadn't been recruited for the crisis communications job and then asked to help with optics. She had been identified as a solution before she was ever offered the problem. The recruiter who placed her had no idea what she was walking into. Neither did Ren. The sequence had been reversed from the start, and I had known it. Not the details. Eleanor had kept those compartmentalized, but the shape of it. The convenience of timing. The way the board had presented the optics solution 3 days after Ren arrived, as if the idea had only just occurred to them. I had noticed. I had not asked questions. Because asking questions would have meant acknowledging that the woman I was falling for had been positioned, not chosen. That the contract she signed had been written before she existed as a variable in my calculations. That everything she thought she'd negotiated for herself had been anticipated and accounted for by people who saw her as a line item. I closed the document. It sat in my inbox like a weight I had chosen to carry rather than put down. The foundation dinner was in 4 weeks. The merger closed in 30 days. Ren was working on the Viridian rebrand analysis in her temporary office 2 floors below me, implementing strategy changes I'd asked for, billing separately because she had negotiated her own terms and believed those terms meant something. She believed in the contract, in the handwritten clause, in the 7 words I'd written in the margin. I want you there. I had meant it when I wrote it. I still meant it now. But I had not earned the right to mean it. Not yet. Not while that document existed, and she didn't know. I picked up my phone. Put it down. Picked it up again. Margot's voice came through the intercom. Mr. Foxwell, your 11 o'clock with the Viridian legal team is in conference room A. Reschedule. A pause. Margot had worked for me for 7 years and had never heard me reschedule a legal meeting. Sir, tell them I have a conflict. Move it to tomorrow. Of course. I stood at the window and looked at the city. 41 floors up, the world looked manageable. Grids and systems and predictable patterns. I had built my life around the principle that problems had solutions and resources prevented loss. I had spent 16 years accumulating enough resources to prevent any loss that mattered. Standing there, I understood for the first time that some losses couldn't be prevented with acquisition strategies and operational efficiency. Some losses happened because you treated the person like architecture instead of a human being, and by the time you realized the error, the damage was already structural. The document sat in my inbox. I had not yet decided how long I intended to carry it before it became something else entirely. I opened my calendar. The foundation dinner entry glowed on the screen. 4 weeks out, confirmed attendance, Ren Calloway listed as my +1. Below that, Eleanor had scheduled a board check-in for the following morning. Subject, Optics Progress Assessment. She wanted a report on whether the engagement strategy was working, whether the narrative had stabilized, whether the asset was performing as designed. I thought about Ren in her temporary office, revising the rebrand timeline because I'd asked her to, billing separately because she'd negotiated her own terms, wearing a ring that fit without being sized because someone had anticipated that too. I thought about the way she'd looked at me when I wrote those 7 words, the almost belief in her expression, the distance I had put there. I thought about what it would cost me to close that distance, what it would require. The truth would require it. The truth would destroy what we were building. The truth was the only thing that might save it. I closed the calendar, closed the email, closed everything except the view of the city through the glass. 30 days until the merger closed. 4 weeks until the foundation dinner. And somewhere between now and then, I was going to have to decide whether I was the man who protected her from the truth or the man who told it to her anyway. I didn't know yet which one she'd want me to be. I didn't know yet which one I was capable of being. But I knew that the document existed, and I had not told her, and every hour that passed was a choice I was making. The kind of choice that couldn't be unmade once she found out. And she would find out. People always did.
Chapter 10. Dorian Foxwell.
The Meridian follow-up cycle closed on a Tuesday, and I read the industry newsletter citation 3 times before I allowed myself to acknowledge what it meant. 3 outlets. Model response. Her name nowhere in the article, but her fingerprints on every sentence. I set my phone on the desk and looked at the document I'd been avoiding for 6 days, the one Eleanor had sent with the subject line Viridian Integration, Optics Architecture, Status Review, and the timestamp that predated Wren's recruitment by 8 weeks. Page 3 sat open on my screen, the words Contractor to Partner Pipeline burning a hole through whatever remained of my justification. I closed the laptop. The 38th floor was quiet at 7 in the morning, the kind of silence that usually suited me. No voices, no interruptions, just the hum of climate control and the distant murmur of the city 42 floors below. Today the silence felt like accusation. She didn't know. She was a few weeks into a 6-month contract, producing work that spoke for itself, building something real out of the rubble my communications team had left behind, and she didn't know that the board had architected her role before she'd ever applied. I should tell her. I didn't tell her. Instead, I went to her office at 9:15 with a question about the foundation dinner brief that was technically legitimate, and watched her answer it in 40 seconds flat, her attention already returning to her screen before I'd finished processing the response. Was there something else? There was. There was a document on my laptop that would end whatever this was between us. There was the fact that I'd known for 6 days and hadn't said a word. There was the specific weight of her trust, given carefully, given despite her architecture of caution, and the knowledge that I was holding something that would shatter it. The subsidiary rebrand, I said instead. The Viridian rollout. I want your read. Her fingers paused on the keyboard. That's outside my contract scope. I know. She looked at me for a long moment, the particular assessment she did when she was deciding whether to give something away. Then she set down her pen and gave me 15 minutes of unfiltered strategic analysis, no notes, 2 specific recommendations that I took without argument. When she finished, I didn't leave. She noticed. She always noticed. The talking points for the foundation dinner, she said, pulling a folder from the stack on her desk. Final draft. I've incorporated the changes from last week. I took the folder. I read the first page without reading it. The words blurred into shapes while my attention tracked the specific way she held her coffee cup. The slight chip on the rim, the dark roast she'd mentioned once in passing 3 weeks ago, the warmth of her hands wrapped around it. These are good, I said. I know. The corner of her mouth twitched, not quite a smile, something closer. The thing that had been undoing me for the past few weeks. I left her office at 9:47 and spent the next 3 hours in back-to-back acquisition calls, and thought about her the entire time. The pattern had no contract language, but it had rhythm. Tuesdays and Thursdays, irregular hours, legitimate questions for the first 5 minutes. Both of us aware of what happened after the questions ran out. The specific gravity of staying in a room together when neither of us had to be there. The weight of proximity chosen rather than required. By then, Margot had stopped announcing when I went to Wren's floor. Not long after, Wren's name appeared on my calendar in blocks marked Strategy Review that both of us understood were not about strategy. On a Thursday that ran long, talking points, media cycle analysis, a sidebar about the Viridian subsidiary that turned into an hour of her walking me through communications architecture I should have understood years ago. Margot appeared in Wren's doorway with an apologetic expression. The conference room is booked for a client call at 9. I can move the materials to the penthouse if you need more time. I looked at Wren. She looked at me. The penthouse has a conference table, I said, as if that explained anything. We took the private elevator, in silence. The doors opened onto the space I'd designed for function and occupied without thinking, the kitchen I rarely used, the living room I crossed without seeing, the view of the city I'd stopped noticing sometime around year 3. Wren walked through it like she walked through any unfamiliar space, taking inventory. I watched her catalog the empty drying rack, the shelves with no broken spines, the controlled environment of a life built for optimization rather than living. She didn't comment. She sat at the kitchen counter with her laptop and opened the foundation brief and said, Section 3 needs a stronger transition. We worked. For 2 hours, the only sounds were keystrokes and pen strokes, and the occasional low traffic noise from 42 floors below. She made notes in the margins of her draft. I reviewed the Viridian timeline on my legal pad. The city glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, indifferent to whatever was accumulating in the space between us. I looked up once because I'd been working through a clause and needed to think, and my eyes moved without instruction. She was watching me. Not reading me, not assessing me, simply attending. The same focused stillness I applied to acquisition data turned in my direction, and she didn't look away when I found her doing it. I didn't look away either. The moment held. The city continued its indifferent illumination. Somewhere below us, 9,000 employees were wrapping up their workdays, going home to lives that included dinner and conversation, and all the ordinary rhythms I'd forgotten how to perform. I wanted this. The specific shape of it, her here, working across from me in a space that had never felt inhabited until now. I closed my laptop. She set down her pen. The 4 feet of counter between us lasted approximately 10 seconds. I didn't decide to move. My body was already in motion, crossing the distance, reaching for her. Staying where I was, and maintaining the careful architecture of whatever this was had become impossible. Her blazer was off before I'd consciously thought about removing it. My jacket followed. Her hands found the warmth of my back beneath my untucked shirt, and the sound she made, low and surprised and wanting, undid weeks of discipline in a single exhale. Tell me this is what you want. My voice came out rougher than I intended, my hands at her waist, thumbs pressing against the fabric at her hips. Tell me to stop, and I stop. Don't stop. I lifted her onto the counter. Documents scattered, the foundation brief, my legal pad. 3 weeks of careful preparation swept aside by my forearm as I positioned her where I wanted her. Her blouse unbuttoned from the bottom up. I took my time with it, unhurried, deliberate, each button a decision. She watched my hands with the same focused attention she gave everything, and when I spread the fabric open, she inhaled sharply, and her fingers tightened on my shoulders. Dorian. I'd heard her say my name in meetings, in arguments. In the careful professional register she maintained, even when she was telling me I was wrong. This was different, my name as admission, as surrender, as something she was giving me that I hadn't known I was asking for. I bent my head and pressed my mouth to the curve of her throat. She tasted like coffee and something distinctly her, and when I traced the line of her collarbone, she arched into me. Look at me, I whispered. Her eyes opened, dark with want, her pupils blown wide, and she looked at me the way she'd looked at me across the counter earlier, seeing me, attending to me, choosing to be present in this moment instead of performing her way through it. I let go of the control I had carried for 15 years. Everything after that was a blur of the specific focus I applied to everything, reading her body, the city continuing its indifferent illumination 42 floors below us, and the specific unreality of this moment happening in a space that had never felt inhabited until she walked into it. I followed her over the edge with her name on my lips, the world shattering into something new and undeniable. We stayed like that for a long moment, breathing hard, her forehead resting against mine. The city grid glittered through the windows. The documents lay scattered on the counter around us. I didn't step back immediately. I stayed with her and held her, and she let me, and this was the part that had no contract language, this specific gravity, this weight of choosing to stay in the moment rather than managing my exit. She shifted, reaching for her blouse. I caught her wrist. Gentle. Not restraining, just stopping. Stay. She looked at me. The woman who checked every clause, who built her life from the rubble of trusting someone who hadn't earned it, who had every reason to walk away from this before it became something she couldn't audit. The car can take you home later, I said. Or tomorrow. Stay. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at my hand on her wrist, at my face, at the penthouse around us with its empty shelves and controlled surfaces and all the evidence of a life built for function rather than living. Okay, she said finally. I'll stay. Margot called the car at midnight. Wren gathered her things with the same efficiency she brought to everything. Laptop in the bag, folder tucked against her side, the foundation brief reassembled from the documents we'd scattered across the counter. She looked at me once before the elevator arrived, and I wanted to say something that wasn't about logistics or contracts or the specific architecture of what we'd built. I said nothing. She rode home to Brooklyn in my car because I'd insisted, framing it as operational, late hour, the unnecessary drive, and she'd let it be that because she was tired and because she was starting to trust me in ways I didn't deserve. I stood at the window after she left and looked at the city and thought about the document on my laptop. Page 3. Contractor to partner pipeline. The specific weight of her trust, given carefully, and the knowledge that I was holding something that would shatter it. I should tell her. I opened my phone. Her name was on the internal access list. I'd put it there myself, 3 weeks before any professional reason required it. I stared at it for a long time, this small evidence of the thing I'd been building without naming it. My phone buzzed. A text from Ren, home safe. The brief is good. See you Thursday. 3 sentences. Ordinary. The most human exchange I'd had in years. I closed the app. I went to bed. I did not sleep. The ring she'd agreed to wear for the optics engagement sat in its velvet box in my desk drawer, where she'd left it after the charity auction. I'd told myself it was a contractual asset, a prop, a thing that would be returned upon termination. I'd stopped believing that somewhere around week 6. I lay in the dark and thought about her apartment in Brooklyn, the space she'd built from nothing, the consultancy with its corkboards and client printouts, and the plant she'd named Gerald, and understood that I was falling into something I couldn't control. The document waited on my laptop. The truth waited with it. I didn't tell her. Not yet.
Chapter 11. Dorian Foxwell.
The call came at 6:52 a.m. Margot's number, which meant something had gone wrong before the day had properly started. I was on the treadmill, running at a pace that matched the rhythm of the acquisition clause I'd been reviewing in my head for the past 20 minutes. The Viridian close was 14 days out. Everything was on track. The board had stopped sending anxious check-in emails. Ren's Meridian work had settled into the public record like a foundation stone, something other companies would study and replicate badly. I answered without slowing my pace. What? I forwarded something by mistake. Margot's voice was tight, in a way I had never heard from her. To Ren. About 20 minutes ago. I hit the emergency stop. The belt jerked beneath my feet. What did you forward? The board presentation from 4 months ago. The stakeholder confidence architecture deck. I was pulling files for the pre-close review and she stopped. Started again. Page 3. The contractor to partner pipeline section. The room went very still. I had read that section. I had read it the week after Eleanor first mentioned the image stabilization strategy, when I was still telling myself the engagement addendum was operational, that Ren's presence in my life was a function of contract language rather than the reason I kept finding excuses to stand in her doorway. The section described a profile, boutique crisis PR, recently available, credibly independent, and a sequence. The optics problem was identified first. The contractor who fit the profile was recruited second. Ren had been drafted into a role, designed before she knew she was being measured for it. Does she know you sent it by mistake? I don't. I sent a follow-up immediately, explaining the error, asking her to disregard. She hasn't responded. I closed my eyes. 40 minutes. She had been sitting with that document for 40 minutes. Cancel my morning, I said. All of it. Dorian. Cancel it. I ended the call and stood in the silence of my penthouse, sweat cooling on my skin, and understood with perfect clarity that every calculation I had made in the past 3 months was about to collapse. I showered. I dressed. I did not call her. I knew what I would hear if I called. The silence of someone who was deciding what category to file me in, and this time the category would be correct. I had known about the document for weeks. I had chosen not to tell her. I had told myself it was confidentiality, operational discretion, the kind of thing that would resolve itself when the merger closed and the contracts expired, and whatever was between us could exist without the architecture that had created it. I had been wrong. I took the elevator to the ground floor and walked through the lobby without acknowledging anyone. My driver was waiting at the curb. I told him to stay. I walked to the subway station 3 blocks east and took the train to Brooklyn. The ride was 42 minutes. I spent all of them staring at the window and seeing nothing, my phone heavy in my pocket, Margot's number accumulating missed calls that I did not return. Callaway Communications occupied the second floor of a mixed-use building in a neighborhood I had never visited. I walked through the street-level door and climbed the narrow stairs and found myself in a small waiting area with corkboards on every wall, client printouts pinned in layers, a plant on the windowsill that someone had labeled with a handwritten sign that said Gerald. Petra, Wren's assistant, looked up from her desk. She recognized me. I saw it in the brief widening of her eyes, but she did not smile. "She's in her office," she said. She didn't say she was expecting anyone. "She's not." Petra hesitated. Then she picked up her phone, pressed a button, and said quietly, "There's someone here to see you." A pause. Dorian Foxwell. The silence on the other end of the line was loud enough to hear from where I stood. "Send him in," Wren said finally. Her office was small and bright, and cluttered in a way that looked intentional rather than careless. Files stacked on every surface. A second plant in the corner, labeled. No window facing the door. Her desk faced the wall, which I understood immediately was a choice about focus rather than hospitality. She was sitting with her laptop open, coffee mug beside her hand, the velvet ring box on the desk between us. She had taken off the ring. "Close the door," she said. I closed it. I did not sit. There was no chair on my side of the desk that would have made sitting feel like anything other than retreat. "The merger," she said. I looked at her. She was watching me the way she had watched me in the first meeting weeks ago, cataloging, assessing, deciding whether I was a variable she could work with or an obstacle she needed to navigate around. I had spent 12 weeks learning the difference between her professional face and her real one. This was the professional face. "I should have told you," I said. "You should have asked me." Her voice was level. Controlled. The kind of control that cost her something to maintain. I could have said yes. I might have said yes. "You didn't give me the choice." The contract structure required confidentiality. The words came out before I could stop them, and I heard them land the way she heard them, as justification, as the language of someone who thought in frameworks rather than people, and I watched her face go still in a way that was worse than anger. "I am not a contract structure," she said. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. She stood. She did not raise her voice. She crossed to the window and looked out at the street below, her back to me, her shoulders straight in a way that reminded me of the charity auction, the way she had held the room without performing for it. "Page 3, she said. "Contractor to partner pipeline. Image stabilization for Viridian Close." The timestamp was 4 months ago. 8 weeks before the recruiter called me. Yes. The profile wasn't my name. It was my shape. Boutique Crisis PR. Recently available. Credibly independent. She turned to face me. Someone measured for me before I knew I was being fitted. Eleanor drafted it. The board approved it. I didn't know until when? I stopped. The silence stretched between us, and I understood that she was not asking when I had learned. She was asking when I had decided not to tell her. 3 weeks ago, I said. She absorbed that. 3 weeks. The foundation dinner addendum. The night I had asked her to stay, and she had said yes, and I had lain awake afterward with her name on the internal access list, and her coffee mug in my cabinet, and the document sitting in my inbox like a bomb I had chosen not to defuse. You made me a component, she said, in something you were building. Not a partner. A part. I wanted to argue. I wanted to explain that the document predated everything that mattered, that what had happened between us was real, regardless of what had created the proximity, that I had been trying to find the right moment to tell her, and there had never been a right moment because every moment with her had felt too valuable to risk. But I had spent 15 years learning how to construct arguments that served my purposes, and I recognized one when I was building it. Yes, I said instead. I did. She picked up her bag, then the ring box, and held it for a moment, looking at it, and then she set it back on the desk between us. The engagement addendum terminated after the charity auction, she said. The crisis communications contract has 3 weeks remaining. I'll complete the deliverables remotely. Margot can coordinate the handoff. Ren. Don't. The word was quiet, but it stopped me cold. Don't manage me through this. Don't tell me what you were going to do. Don't explain the confidentiality structure. I've heard it. I understand it. I just don't accept it. She walked past me toward the door. I did not reach for her. I did not block her path. I stood in her small bright office with the ring box on the desk, and the plant named Gerald on the windowsill, and watched her leave. At the door she paused. I built this consultancy from 2 clients and a kitchen table after someone I trusted dissolved our shared firm and kept everything I'd made. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the cost of the steadiness. I documented everything. I left quietly. I started over. I swore I would never let anyone arrange my life from inside a framework I didn't know about. She looked at me over her shoulder. You knew that. You read my file. You knew exactly what you were doing when you decided not to tell me. She left. I stood in her office for a long time afterward, staring at the ring box, understanding for the first time in my life that there was no move I could make that would solve this. The subway ride back to Manhattan took 42 minutes. I spent all of them staring at my reflection in the dark window, the train rocking beneath me, strangers pressing close on either side with their headphones and their ordinary Tuesday faces. I thought about the safe in my office, the letters from my mother, the thank you notes I had kept and never answered. I thought about Ren standing in her temporary office doorway a few weeks ago, telling me my audit timeline was wrong, her eyes steady and her voice certain, and her complete lack of interest in impressing me. I thought about the charity auction. The way she had told Elaine Corey, that makes 2 of us without flinching. I thought about the penthouse, her face in the city light, her hands on my chest, her voice saying, okay, I'll stay, like it was a choice that cost her something, and she had decided to pay. I had spent 15 years building an empire on the principle that resources prevented loss. That if you were wealthy enough, powerful enough, controlled enough, you could keep the things that mattered. I had lost something anyway. Not because I lacked resources. Because I had treated her the way I treated the architecture. Margot was waiting when I arrived at the office. She had canceled my morning. She had rescheduled the board check-in. She had prepared a briefing on the Viridian pre-close timeline, which I did not read. Do you want me to reach out to her? Margot asked. Officially. Through the consultancy. No. The deliverables. She'll complete them. She said she would. I sat at my desk and looked at the safe behind the panel and did not open it. She keeps her word. Margot hesitated in the doorway. Dorian. I'm sorry. The forward was my mistake. It wasn't the forward. I looked at her. It was the 3 weeks I spent knowing and not telling her. The forward just accelerated the timeline. She nodded once and left me alone. I sat at my desk for a long time. The city stretched out beyond the glass on 3 sides. The merger closed in 14 days. The board was satisfied. The share price was stable. Everything I had built was functioning exactly as designed. I opened my phone and looked at Ren's name on the internal access list. She had not returned the badge. Technically, she could still enter the building, access the elevator, sit at the desk in the temporary office that still had her coffee mug on the corner. She wouldn't. I closed the app. I picked up the Viridian acquisition timeline, and I read it from beginning to end, and when I finished, I could not remember a single word. The week passed. I went to meetings. I reviewed documents. I answered emails from board members who wanted to celebrate the impending close, and did not know that the woman who had made the close possible had walked out of my life with a ring box on the desk between us. I did not call her. She did not call me. On day 3, I asked Margot to reach out through official channels, purely operational, purely professional, the kind of communication that could have come from any contractor manager to any consultant. Margot sent the email. Ren responded within the hour, with the first set of deliverables attached. They were flawless. They were exactly what the contract required. There was nothing personal in the message. Not a single word that acknowledged anything beyond the scope of work. I read it 4 times. Then I closed it and did not read it again. On day 6, I opened the safe. The box of letters was where I had left it. My mother's handwriting on the envelopes, the paper soft with age, the words inside still carrying her voice, even though I hadn't opened them in years. I held the box in my hands and thought about the week she died. The charity hospital. The hallway where she had lain waiting for treatment that never came because I had been too poor to make anyone listen. I had built an empire to make sure nothing I loved would ever be lost for lack of resources. But resources had not been the problem with Ren. I had been the problem. I put the box back in the safe and closed it. Day 11. The Viridian close was 3 days away. The board had scheduled a celebration dinner. Eleanor had sent a congratulatory memo that used the phrase "successful integration" 17 times. I canceled my afternoon calls. I told Margot I was leaving early. She did not ask where I was going. I checked the weather on my phone. Rain. I put the phone in my pocket without retrieving an umbrella. I walked to Brooklyn. The rain started somewhere around the bridge. I did not stop. I did not hail a cab or duck into a doorway. I walked through the streets of a borough I had never visited, rain soaking through my jacket, my hair plastered to my forehead, the architecture of my empire dissolving behind me with every step. I did not have a plan. I did not have a solution. I had only the knowledge that I had been wrong, and that being wrong required something from me that money could not buy. When I reached her building, I climbed the narrow stairs and walked into the waiting area with water dripping from my jacket onto the floor. Petra looked up from her desk and her eyes went wide. "I'm here to see Ren," I said. "I don't have an appointment. I don't have a plan. I just need her to know that I know I was wrong." Petra stared at me for a long moment. Then she picked up the phone.
Chapter 12. Dorian Foxwell.
The city did not care that it was 11 at night, and neither did the glass. 3 walls of it held the midtown grid in cold suspension, indifferent and lit and enormous, the same view that had always meant control to me and meant nothing tonight. I sat at my desk without having worked for 40 minutes. The Viridian acquisition timeline, 4th review, same pages, no retention, lay open in front of me like an argument I could not follow. Numbers that should have meant something. Projections I had built my quarter around. None of it registered past the surface of my eyes. Margot's call log showed 6 outgoing attempts on my behalf, all unreturned. All of them Ren. I had not asked Margot to make a 7th because I understood with a precision that surprised me that the 7th call wouldn't be communication. It would be pressure. And I had already applied enough of that without ever calling it what it was. The city scrolled on below me, indifferent to the mess I had made of something that mattered. I was aware, in the particular way that comes only from the absence of distraction, that I was sitting in a room designed to make me feel impregnable. Floor-to-ceiling windows. A desk that faced the door. Art on the walls that cost more than most people made in a decade. Every element calculated to project authority, competence, the kind of man who did not lose things because he had made losing impossible. It was not working. This was new. I did not know what to do with new. I picked up the Viridian file again, turned to the integration timeline, and read the same paragraph 3 times without comprehension. The words sat on the page like shapes in a language I used to speak fluently. 30 days to close. Stable optics required through the window. Board confidence at acceptable thresholds. Somewhere in Brooklyn, Ren was not returning my calls. And the file in my hands felt like holding water. The following morning, Eleanor convened the board check-in at 9 o'clock sharp in the corner conference room, the one with the better lighting, the one we used when we wanted to project confidence to ourselves. I sat at the head of the table and listened to the language of successful operations. Eleanor led the review with her usual precision. The 2 public events had generated positive sentiment metrics across 4-track platforms. Ren's Meridian work had been cited in 3 industry newsletters as a model response framework. The Viridian close was tracking to schedule, all stakeholders aligned, no outstanding objections from regulatory review. The image stabilization strategy, Eleanor said, not looking up from her tablet, has performed its function and concluded cleanly. She used the word concluded the way she used all words, precisely, without residue, like setting down a tool she no longer needed. The board received it the same way. Nodding around the table. Satisfied murmurs about metrics and timeline adherence. Marcus Chen from Acquisitions made a note on his legal pad. Rosa Demetrio asked a clarifying question about the Viridian integration communications handoff. Everyone moved through the agenda like professionals processing a completed project. And I sat there and watched this happen and felt something that did not have a name in any framework I had built. The people in this room were correct. Every metric supported their conclusions. Every data point validated their assessment. The strategy had worked exactly as designed. The engagement had served its purpose. The contractor had delivered exceptional results. Case closed. And every one of them was wrong. I said nothing. I did not trust what I would say if I started. Eleanor moved to the next agenda item. I contributed where required, a question about the Singapore office expansion, a directive on the Q3 projection adjustments, but my voice sounded distant to my own ears, like I was listening to myself through glass. The meeting ended at the 1-hour mark. Board members filtered out in 2s and 3s, already pivoting to their next obligations. Eleanor paused at the door and gave me a look I did not want to interpret. "Good outcome, Dorian," she said. "Clean execution all around." I nodded. She left. I sat alone in the conference room for 2 full minutes before I stood up. Her temporary office was on the floor below mine, which had always been a reasonable arrangement, which I had always told myself was about operational logistics, which was a lie I had believed, because believing it was easier than examining it. I walked there without making a decision to walk there. My body took the direction before my reasoning caught up, and by the time I registered what I was doing, I was already standing in the doorway of an empty room. The desk was clean. The laptop dock was gone. The mug, the one she used for her dark roast, the one with the small chip on the rim that she always turned away from her mouth, was gone. The chair was pushed in at the precise angle that cleaning staff used, which meant she had not been back. Not to retrieve anything she missed. Not to leave a note. Not to give me any closing gesture I could interpret as an opening. But the sticky note was still there. I stepped into the room without turning on the lights. Crossed to her desk. Looked at the dark monitor screen where a small yellow square remained stuck to the lower right corner, her handwriting visible even in the dim spill from the hallway. Meridian follow-up. Confirm Reuters quote approval by Thursday. Something she had written in the ordinary run of work. A task reminder she had never peeled away because she had been pulled from this desk for a conversation in my office that ended with a ring box on the table between us and nothing between us after. I did not remove it. Removing it felt like a kind of erasure I was not willing to perform. Like admitting she had been here and was now not here, and the space between those two facts was something I had caused. I stood in her empty office for longer than I should have, then left without touching anything else. I tried to work for 3 hours. I reviewed 2 contracts with language I had approved a dozen times before, and found myself reading clauses about indemnification like they were written in code. I initiated a reply to the Singapore office about their facility expansion timeline, got 4 sentences in, and closed the draft without sending it. At 1 in the afternoon, I picked up my phone and called David Reiner, my corporate counsel. "The engagement memo," I said without preamble. "The board presentation on image stabilization from 4 months ago. The confidentiality clause embedded in Section 3. Is that a legal obligation or operational discretion?" David paused. I could hear him pulling up the document, the soft clicks of his keyboard. "Operational discretion," he said after a moment. "It's framed as confidentiality guidance, not a binding clause. Standard board practice for strategic communications, but there's no enforcement mechanism. It's always been." "Thank you," I said, and ended the call. I set the phone down on my desk and sat with that for a long time. The shape of it. The particular smallness of it. I had not deceived Ren because I was legally required to. I had deceived her because my architecture called it structure, and I had not questioned the architecture. Because the board memo said confidentiality, and I had let that word do the work of an excuse. Because it was easier to tell myself I was following protocol than to admit I was making a choice and making it wrong. The confidentiality had always been optional. The deception had always been mine. At 4:30, I went to my office safe. The panel that concealed it looked like cabinetry, which was intentional. I had never wanted visitors to know it existed, had never wanted to explain what I kept inside. I pressed my thumb to the biometric reader and waited for the soft click of the lock disengaging. Inside, documents I should have digitized years ago. The original incorporation papers for Foxwell Technologies, signed in a one-room office that no longer existed. Stock certificates from the first round of funding. And at the bottom, underneath everything else, a small battered box that I had carried through every office, every building, every acquisition for 16 years. I took it out. I did not open it. I had not been able to open it for years. The handwriting inside was too specific, too much like hearing her voice in a room she was not in. But I held it, felt the weight of it in my hands, the worn corners and the faded label where she had written for Dorian in the particular slant of her cursive. My mother's letters. She had written them during her treatment, during the months when I was 23, and working 3 jobs, and still not making enough to move her to a facility that might have caught the misdiagnosis in time. She had written them because she knew. Not that she was dying. The doctors had told her she was recovering, the same doctors who had missed what was killing her, but that I would need something to hold on to when she was gone. I had not read them since the first year. I could not. But I had kept them. They were the only object I had ever allowed to be irreplaceable. Her illness had taught me one lesson, and I had built 16 years on it: get resources, hold control, never be caught without a solution. I had made poverty impossible. I had made loss impossible. I had constructed a world where problems were solved with leverage, and proximity to resources prevented the specific kind of helplessness that had killed her. I had a private elevator and a car and 9,000 employees, and influence enough that my offhand comments became industry trends. I had built exactly what I set out to build. And Ren Calloway had stood in my office and told me she was not a contract structure, and walked out quietly, and I had not produced a single move. Not one. The resources had been completely beside the point. I put the box back in the safe. Closed the panel. Returned to my desk. The Viridian timeline was still open. The city was still lit. And I was still sitting in a room designed to make me feel impregnable, feeling nothing of the kind. At 6 o'clock, I told Margot to cancel Thursday's external calls. She received this with the particular professional neutrality of someone who had been watching me for 3 days and had already formed conclusions she was keeping to herself. Her eyes flicked to my face and back to her tablet in the space of a breath. "All of them?" she asked. "All of them. The Singapore call is with their facilities director. We've rescheduled twice." "Reschedule again. Send my apologies." She nodded and made the note. "Then, do you want the car arranged for anything?" "No." The word sat strangely. No was not usually how I operated. No was a door I closed on other people, not a door I held open for myself. Margot waited another moment, as if expecting me to amend the answer. When I didn't, she gathered her tablet and left. I walked to the window. The Midtown grid stretched out below me, all that deliberate light, all that organized motion. The infrastructure of a world I understood completely, and had built toward completely. Acquisition targets I could name by their floor count. Competitors whose strategies I had mapped and countered. A landscape that responded to my decisions, the way water responds to displacement. And I stood there holding the small fact of what I had lost and how I had lost it. Not for lack of resources. Not for leverage. Not because I had been outmaneuvered or outspent or caught without options. Because I had looked at a person and seen a component. Because she had trusted me with something that was not in the brief. And I had routed it through the architecture instead of returning it the way it deserved to be returned. I had spent 15 years ensuring nothing I valued would be lost for lack of means, and it had not been enough. Because the thing I had lost was not a problem that money solved. And I was aware, slowly, with the specific discomfort of learning something that rearranges prior knowledge, that I had known this was true, and built my life as though it weren't. I closed the safe. I picked up my jacket from the chair where I had set it at 8 that morning, and not touched since. I checked the weather on my phone. Reflex, habit, the instinct to prepare to arrive with information, to optimize the approach, and then I stopped. I registered what I was doing. The way I was already calculating the route, the timing, the variables I could control. I put the phone in my pocket without finishing the search. I was going to Brooklyn. I was going without a plan. And that was the point.
Chapter 13. Dorian Foxwell.
The rain had stopped somewhere between 34th and the Brooklyn Bridge, but I hadn't noticed until I was standing in front of her building with water dripping from my jacket onto concrete that was already dry. My shoes squelched with every step. My shirt clung to my shoulders like a second skin. The suit, custom-tailored, $12,000, chosen specifically because it photographed well in boardrooms, was ruined. I didn't care. I pushed through the front door of the converted brownstone and climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor, where a frosted glass door read Callaway Communications in modest black lettering. Through the glass I could see movement, shapes, light, the ordinary chaos of a small business operating on a Tuesday morning. 11 days. 11 days of silence, of unreturned calls, of staring at the velvet ring box on my desk like it might spontaneously combust and take me with it. 11 days of reviewing acquisition timelines I couldn't focus on, attending board meetings where I said the right words while thinking about nothing except the way she'd looked at me when she said I am not a contract structure. I had no plan. For possibly the first time in 16 years, I had walked into a situation without an exit strategy, without leverage, without a single move prepared. I was standing in a hallway in Brooklyn with wet shoes and nothing to offer, except the truth, which I had never been particularly good at. The door opened before I could reach for the handle. A young woman with short dark hair and an expression of careful neutrality looked at me, then past me, then back at my face. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Ren Callaway." "Do you have an appointment?" "No." She waited. I waited. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, which I suspected was intentional. My name is Dorian Foxwell, I said. I don't have an appointment. I understand if she doesn't want to see me. Something shifted in the woman's expression. Recognition, maybe, or the particular calculation of someone deciding how much trouble they were willing to facilitate. She stepped back into the office and said, without turning around, "There's someone in the lobby asking for you." "No appointment. He says his name is Dorian Foxwell." I heard Wren's voice from somewhere deeper in the space, too muffled to make out the words. The woman, Petra, her assistant, nodded once and turned back to me. I remembered her from the file. "She'll be out in a minute. You can wait here." I stepped inside. The office was exactly what I'd imagined, and nothing like what I was used to. Corkboards covered one wall, pinned with client drafts and printouts and what appeared to be a hand-drawn timeline in purple marker. A low shelf held a collection of awards that hadn't been properly hung, just propped against the wall, casual, like they mattered less than the work that earned them. On the windowsill, a plant I recognized from Wren's desk at Foxwell Technologies sat in a terracotta pot, catching the thin Brooklyn morning light. Gerald. She'd named it Gerald. I stood in the middle of this small, bright space, her space built by her hands, belonging to no one else, and understood with sudden clarity that I had nothing to offer her that she hadn't already given herself. Then she appeared in the doorway, and every prepared sentence I'd rehearsed on the walk evaporated. She looked the same. Professional. Composed. The kind of steady that came from years of walking into rooms that didn't want her and holding her ground anyway. But there was something around her eyes, a careful distance, a wall that hadn't been there before I'd put it there. "I'm not here to fix it," I said before she could speak, before she could tell me to leave, before I could lose my nerve. "I know I can't fix it." She didn't move. Didn't cross her arms or step back or give me any of the signals that would tell me to stop. She just waited the way she always waited, patient, precise, giving me exactly enough rope to hang myself. "I made decisions about your life from inside a framework I didn't invite you into." The words came out slower than I expected, each one costing something I wasn't used to paying. I told myself it was structure. Confidentiality. How these things work. I stopped. My hands moved at my sides, restless, looking for a pen to roll between my fingers, or a phone to check, or any of the 100 small motions I used to occupy myself when I didn't know what to do. "It was control," I said. "I'm good at control." She still hadn't spoken. Petra was very obviously staring at her computer screen, with the focused intensity of someone pretending to be elsewhere. "I am not good at this." I gestured vaguely at the space between us, at the office, at the situation I'd created and had no idea how to uncreate. "I don't know how to be a person outside the architecture I built." I told myself I was protecting you by not telling you. I was protecting myself. You were going to tell me. It wasn't quite a question. There was no softness in it, no escape hatch of ambiguity she was offering me. "I don't know." The admission scraped against something raw. I want to say yes. I don't know if it's true. I'm trying not to. I stopped again, caught the instinct, forced myself to name it. I'm trying not to manage what this sounds like. Something shifted in her expression. Small, almost invisible, but I'd spent weeks learning to read her and I saw it. The recognition that I'd caught myself doing the thing I always did. The fact that I'd named it, instead of hiding behind it. "That merger," she said. "Did you need me for it?" "The board thought so." "Do you?" I looked at her, really looked the way I'd been looking since the first morning she walked into my conference room and told me I was wrong about my own audit timeline. The woman who didn't perform for rooms that didn't want her. Who built her own architecture because she'd learned the hard way what happened when someone else controlled the blueprints. "I needed you," I said. "Not for the merger." The room was small. The plant on the windowsill caught the light. Petra's keyboard had gone completely silent. "You're going to have to ask." Wren's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, not softness exactly. Something harder. Something that had been forged in the fire of being used as a component by someone she'd trusted. Not arrange. Not manage. Ask. I know. Every time. I know. Then ask. The silence stretched. I was aware of my wet shoes, my ruined jacket. The fact that I'd walked here in the rain without checking the forecast because checking the forecast would have been planning, and I hadn't wanted to plan. I'd wanted to show up without armor for once in my life. Can I stay? She didn't answer immediately. I watched her make me wait. Not cruelty, I understood that now. Precision. She was deciding what to give and what to withhold, and she was doing it with her eyes open, knowing exactly what it would cost her either way. 7 seconds. 8. Yes, she said. But I have a client call in 20 minutes. Something in my chest released. Not relief exactly, but the particular sensation of setting down something heavy that I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten its weight. I'll wait. She nodded once, the same crisp acknowledgement she'd given me in boardrooms and conference calls, and 100 professional exchanges that had never felt professional at all. Then she turned and walked back to her desk, and I stood in the middle of her lobby watching her go. Petra glanced up from her screen, assessed me with the particular calculation of someone who had just witnessed something she hadn't expected, and went back to her work. I found a chair near the door and sat. The leather was worn, comfortable in a way that suggested actual use rather than design. On the wall above me, a framed certificate from the PRSA sat next to a print of what appeared to be a hand-drawn map of Brooklyn neighborhoods. Her space. Her work. Her life, built from the wreckage of someone else's betrayal, and held together by nothing except her own hands. I pulled out my phone, looked at the screen, and put it away. I pulled it out again, then put it away. 23 minutes later, Wren emerged from her office. The call had run over. I could tell from the slight tension in her shoulders, the way she rolled her neck once before crossing to where I sat. That was the new client, she said. Media strategy for their product launch. Contract came through 4 days ago. Off the Meridian work. Yes. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. I knew what it meant. That her reputation had held, that her work had spoken for itself, that the thing I'd tried to use her as a component in had actually built something real for her instead. She sat in the chair across from me. Not behind her desk, not with the barrier of professional distance between us. Just sat, the way you sit with someone you've decided to have a conversation with instead of an exchange. I'm not going to tell you it's forgiven, she said. It isn't. Not yet. I know. Forgiveness takes time. It gets built, not decided. I know. She studied me for a moment. The ruined suit, the drying hair, the fact that I was sitting in her lobby without my phone in my hand for the first time in what was probably a decade. You walked here? Yes. In the rain. I didn't check the forecast. Something flickered across her face. Not a smile, not warmth, but the particular recognition of someone seeing something unexpected in a familiar landscape. Petra, she said without looking away from me, can you bring him some coffee? Sure. Petra stood, crossed to the small machine in the corner, and returned with a cup that she set on the table between us. The coffee was adequate, wrong ratio, not the dark roast she preferred, but it was warm, and she'd offered it without being asked. Thank you, I said, and I meant it more than the words could carry. I drank the coffee. Wren opened her laptop and began working on something. Client correspondence from the look of it. Her fingers moving across the keyboard with the particular efficiency of someone who had been doing this for years. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask questions. I just sat, and she worked, and Petra navigated the ordinary chaos of a Tuesday morning with the composure of someone who had decided this was now normal. An hour passed. Then 2. Clients called. Emails arrived. Wren took 3 meetings via video conference, and I watched her hold rooms she wasn't physically in with the same steady competence she'd brought to every space I'd seen her enter. At noon, Petra stood and announced she had a lunch meeting. I'll be back by 2, she said, gathering her bag with the particular care of someone who wanted to make a clean exit. "Do you need anything before I go?" "We're fine," Ren said. Petra left. The office fell quiet. Ren closed her laptop and looked at me, really looked the way she had in my conference room on day one, the way that had made me feel like a variable being assessed and reassembled. "You stayed. You said I could. Most people would have left after the first hour." "I'm not most people." Something shifted in her expression. The wall still there, but hairline cracks forming, light beginning to seep through. "No," she said quietly. "You're not." I set down my empty coffee cup. The afternoon light through the window fell across the stack of files on her desk, the plant on the sill, the small evidence of a life she'd built without asking anyone's permission. "I don't know how to do this," I said. "Being a person instead of a portfolio. Asking instead of arranging. I've spent 16 years building systems that solve problems, and you're not a problem I can solve." "No," she agreed. "I'm not. But I want to learn." The words came out rougher than I intended, stripped of the polished precision I used in boardrooms. "I want to learn how to be present in your life, without trying to optimize it. I want to know what you need, before I decide what to offer." She was quiet for a long moment. I watched her think, actually think, the way she did when she was building an argument or solving a problem or deciding whether something was worth her time. "The column runs tomorrow," she said finally. I blinked. "What column?" "Elaine's piece. The financial publication. She's been shopping it too. My sources say it goes live at midnight." I absorbed this, the timing, the implications, the fact that Ren had sources and hadn't thought to mention it until now. "What does it say?" "That I'm a strategic placement. A manufactured presence built to stabilize your optics for the merger." Her voice was steady, almost clinical. "The quote is, she's part of the deal architecture. Dorian doesn't do relationships. He does optimization." The words landed like a blow. Not because they were wrong about the board's intentions, they weren't, but because they were wrong about everything that had happened since. "I'll handle it," I said automatically, the instinct kicking in before I could stop it. "I can call." "No." Her voice was sharp enough to cut. "You don't handle it. We handle it. Together. Or not at all." I stopped. Took a breath. Made myself sit with the discomfort of not immediately solving the problem. "What do you want to do?" Something in her face changed. The recognition of being asked instead of managed. The understanding that I was actually listening. "I draft the response," she said. "You review it. You don't change it without my approval. We run it under both our names, my consultancy letterhead, your signature alongside mine. We make it clear that my work speaks for itself, that my presence in your life was my choice, and that any attempt to reduce me to a component will be met with the receipts to prove otherwise. And if it doesn't work, then at least I fought for myself. On my terms. With someone standing next to me, instead of in front of me." I looked at her. This woman who had walked into my world and refused to be arranged, who had seen through every framework I'd built and demanded better. "Okay," I said. "Tell me what you need." Her laptop opened again. Her fingers found the keyboard. And for the first time in 11 days, we were working together instead of apart.
Chapter 14. Dorian Foxwell.
I read the column twice, standing in the doorway of Ren's Brooklyn office at 7:43 in the morning. The financial trade publication pulled up on her laptop screen from across the room, close enough to read the headline and see the pull quote beneath the charity auction photograph. "She's part of the deal architecture. Dorian doesn't do relationships. He does optimization." The words were Elaine's. Sourced and precise, aimed at the one seam in the narrative where it would do the most structural damage. I walked here from the subway, which I had never done, because yesterday I asked to stay and she let me, and this morning the world had decided to have a position on that. When I looked up from the screen, Ren was at her desk with her coffee, reading the same column on her phone, and she was calm in the specific way that meant she was already several steps ahead of the outrage, cataloging, sequencing, building the response architecture before the emotion could compromise the execution. I watched her finish the article. I did not speak. I understood, standing in the doorway of her office with its cork boards and client printouts, and Gerald the plant in its corner, that whatever happened next was entirely hers to initiate, and that the only correct thing I could do was not arrange it. Wren set her phone face down and looked up at me. "I'm going to draft the response," she said, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who had already decided the shape of the problem. "You can review it. You don't get to change it." "Understood." She held my gaze for one beat, checking for argument, finding none, and turned to her keyboard. For 40 minutes I remained in the chair at the edge of her desk, the one Petra used for client intake, while Wren drafted and printed and revised, laying each version flat on the desk without ceremony, making decisions with the quiet velocity of someone who had spent a decade converting crisis into record. I read every draft. She wasn't softening the narrative or obscuring the sequence. She was reframing it with documented fact. A crisis communications professional with a traceable portfolio, contracted through legitimate channels, whose work had already been characterized in 3 major outlets as a masterclass before any of this became personal. When she handed me the final draft, she uncapped a pen and pointed to the byline. "Add your name here. Not as authorization, as co-author. You were present in this story. Be present in the reframe." I took the pen and added my name, and she watched me do it without comment, and that watching felt more significant than any contract I had signed in the last 15 years. She called Petra, clear, efficient, task-specific, and told her to monitor press response across the 4 platforms most likely to carry secondary coverage. Then she made 2 calls to media contacts whose placement instincts she trusted, her voice carrying none of the tension I could see in the set of her shoulders. The response went out under Callaway Communications letterhead, both names on the byline. I pulled out my phone while she was finishing the second call and sent 3 messages to my legal team. Within the hour, while Wren was still at her desk monitoring press response, Elaine's financial column had been flagged for comment accuracy review by 2 of the 4 outlets that had been considering republishing it. I knew which editorial directors owed their media relationships to introductions I had facilitated. I said nothing about it to Wren, because it was not her problem to manage and it was not my move to announce. When the republication interest died quietly, which she would see through Margot's forwarded update to her still active work account, she would know why. And she would know I had done it without making it a gesture she was obligated to receive. What she saw was not a man performing protection. It was a man who understood, finally, that his resources were tools she could choose, not arrangements she was handed. The column was neutralized within 6 hours. A crisis professional with a documented record, contracted on legitimate terms, who had chosen her presence in his life with the same deliberateness with which he had chosen his in hers. No ammunition. The story had nowhere to go. Elaine did not call. After the response cleared, Wren went quiet for an hour, not cold, not withdrawn, just processing, the way a structure settles after load-bearing stress has passed. I did not fill the silence, which cost me something, because silence without control had never been a state I could tolerate. But I held it. I held it. And then she said, without looking up, "The merger closes in 2 weeks." "Yes." "You don't need me for it." "No." "Good." I waited, watching the small muscle at the corner of her jaw release. She looked up. "That's good. I want the work to be the work, not a function of this." "The work was always the work," I said. "I know that now." She nodded once, not forgiveness, not warmth, something more durable. Acknowledgement that I had understood the distinction, and that the distinction mattered to her more than the apology. Across the room, through the glass partition, Petra was doing an extremely unconvincing impression of someone who was not listening to all of this. Around noon, Wren closed her laptop and stretched her shoulders back, rolling the tension out of her neck in a way that made me want to cross the room and put my hands on her. I stayed in my chair. I had asked to stay. I had not asked to touch. I need food, she said. There's a place 2 blocks over that does decent sandwiches. I'll buy. You'll try. We walked the 2 blocks in what might have been companionable silence, if I had known what companionable silence felt like. The sandwich shop was small, loud, and had exactly the kind of line that suggested the food was worth waiting for. I stood beside her and did not check my phone once, which she noticed. She glanced at my pocket, then at my face, and didn't comment. When we got to the counter, she ordered without looking at the menu. I ordered the same thing she did, because I had no idea what was good here, and copying seemed like the least presumptuous option. You don't even know what's in that, she said as we found a small table by the window. I know you ordered it. She looked at me for a long moment. You're going to have to stop doing that. Doing what? Making everything I do sound like information you're collecting. I considered this. I'm not collecting. I'm paying attention. Same thing with you. It used to be. I unwrapped my sandwich, which turned out to contain something involving prosciutto and fig jam, and realized I had never eaten prosciutto and fig jam in my life. I'm trying to do it differently. She took a bite of her own sandwich and chewed thoughtfully. What does differently look like? I don't know. The admission cost more than I expected. I've never done it before. Wren set down her sandwich. Dorian. Yes. That's the first honest thing you've said to me in weeks. I met her eyes. I know. We ate in silence for several minutes. The fig jam was surprisingly good. Outside, Brooklyn continued being Brooklyn. Pedestrians, traffic, a dog tied to a parking meter looking extremely put upon about the whole situation. Normal life, continuing without regard for the fact that I was sitting in a sandwich shop, trying to learn how to be a person. The merger, Wren said finally. The pre-close review. When is it? This afternoon. You should go. I know. So go. I looked at her, across the table. She had fig jam at the corner of her mouth, and she was the most competent person I had ever met, and I was completely, irreversibly in love with her in a way that I had no language for. Can I come back? I asked. After. She wiped the fig jam away with her napkin. Ask me when you're done. That's not a yes. It's not a no either. She picked up her sandwich again. It's me telling you to ask instead of assume. I stood up. I wanted to kiss her. I wanted to tell her that I understood finally what she had been trying to teach me for weeks, that asking was different from arranging, that presence was different from ownership, that love was different from acquisition. Instead, I said, I'll text you. Good. She didn't look up. Now go run your empire. I went. The Viridian pre-close review was in the large conference room on the 47th floor, and I took the subway to get there because I had taken the subway this morning, and it turned out the city was still the city at street level, loud and unglamorous, and moving regardless of my presence in it, which I found unexpectedly bearable. I arrived 7 minutes late. Eleanor's expression when I entered the conference room said everything about what 7 minutes meant in the context of my reputation for precision. I did not explain it, because the explanation was Brooklyn and a chair at the edge of a desk and a plant named Gerald, and none of that was Eleanor's. I ran the pre-close review cleanly, made 3 decisions that trimmed the remaining exposure on the acquisition terms. Rosa Demetrio asked about the communications handoff, and I told her it was handled, which it was, because Wren had handled it from a temporary office on a floor I no longer visited, and the work had been flawless. The room adjourned at 4:15. I sat for a moment in the silence of the cleared conference table, which was my silence, my pressure, my controlled environment, and recognized with the particular clarity that comes from having recently stood in a room that was the opposite of all of it, that I knew the difference now between a place designed for working and a place designed for living, and that the difference was not the furniture. I texted Wren from the car, closed. She texted back, "Good." It was the most ordinary exchange I had ever had with a person I was in love with, and it was the best. The Viridian acquisition would finalize in 14 days. The engagement addendum, the contract that had started all of this, had expired after the charity auction and had never been renewed. What continued was mutual choice, not clause. The crisis communications engagement had 3 weeks remaining on its term, but Ren had already completed most of the deliverables remotely, and the outstanding items were administrative. When the contracts expired, what remained would have no language of structure to hide behind. No clause, no addendum, no engagement scope to call it. I sat in the back of the car and understood that I would need to say something to her that was not a deal, not a memo, not a 7-word handwritten clause, but a sentence with my name on it that asked without arranging. I did not yet have the sentence. But I had time. And I had, for the first time in 15 years, something I wanted more than I wanted to control it. My phone buzzed. Ren. The republication died. I waited. I know why. I typed, "I didn't tell you because." She responded before I could finish, "I know why you didn't tell me too." A pause. Then, "Come back tomorrow. We should talk." I set my phone down and looked out at the city scrolling past the window. The same city I had watched from glass offices and private cars and penthouse windows for a decade and a half, always from above, always from a distance. Tomorrow, I would take the subway to Brooklyn. I would sit in a small bright office with corkboards and client printouts and a plant named Gerald. I would ask instead of arrange. And I would find the sentence.
Chapter 15. Dorian Foxwell.
The contract expired on a Tuesday, and I found out through Margot's calendar notification rather than any formal communication. The contract had reached its end. The final deliverable, a media monitoring summary and communications retrospective, had arrived in my inbox at 9:02 a.m., formatted precisely, delivered without ceremony. I read it twice. Not for the content, which was characteristically excellent, but for some trace of her in the language. There wasn't one. Professional, to the end. I sat at my desk with the document open on one monitor and the Viridian integration timeline on the other, and I accomplished nothing useful for 47 minutes. The merger had closed cleanly 2 weeks ago. The board was satisfied. Eleanor had sent a memo praising the successful optics management without once mentioning Ren's name, which I had noted and filed under things I would address later. At noon I picked up my phone and typed, "Contract closed." 3 minutes passed. My thumb hovered over the screen like a teenager waiting for a response to a first text. Pathetic. I was 39 years old and running a $12 billion company, and I was watching a message thread like it contained the answer to something fundamental. "Yes," she wrote back. I stared at the single word. Then, "Are you in Brooklyn?" "Yes." I stood up from my desk, told Margot I would be unavailable for the afternoon, and walked out of the building before I could talk myself into a more efficient approach. The walk took 43 minutes. I knew this because I had done it before, in the rain, without checking the weather, and arrived at her office looking like a man who had lost a fight with the East River. This time the sky was clear, the temperature reasonable, and I was wearing shoes that cost more than some people's monthly rent, shoes designed for boardrooms, not Brooklyn sidewalks. I walked anyway. Petra looked up when I came through the door of Callaway Communications, and her expression cycled through surprise, recognition, and something that might have been approval, before settling into professional neutrality. "Mr. Foxwell. Is she available?" Petra glanced toward the back office, where I could see Ren's silhouette through the glass partition. "Let me check." She didn't need to. Ren appeared in the doorway before Petra finished standing, her gaze moving over me with the particular assessment I had learned to recognize, cataloging details, drawing conclusions, deciding what category to file me under. "You walked," she said. "Yes." "In those shoes?" I looked down at the Italian leather, now dusty from 43 minutes of pavement. They'll survive. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. Petra, I have a lunch meeting. Take messages. Petra nodded, already reaching for her bag. I'll be at Rosario's if you need me. The door closed behind her, and then it was just the two of us in the small, bright office with its cork boards and client printouts, and the plant named Gerald thriving on the windowsill. I had stood in this room before. I had sat in the chair by her desk while she worked, proving I could be present without agenda. I had learned things about myself in this room I hadn't known I needed to learn. You wanted to ask me something, Ren said. Not a question. How did you know? You walked 40 minutes in $1,000 shoes. You have something to say that couldn't be a text. I took a breath, a full, deliberate breath, the kind I never took before speaking in boardrooms because boardrooms required projection, not honesty. This required honesty. I want to be present in your life, I said. Not arranged. Not contracted. I want to know what you need before I decide what to offer. I want to be someone you don't have to audit. She was quiet. Her gaze held mine without flinching, without softening, just taking in the words and weighing them against everything she knew about who I was and what I had done. You know what I built after Marcus, she said. Yes. You know why I check every clause. Yes. You're going to make mistakes. Yes. She leaned forward slightly, and I saw the test in her posture, the boundary she was setting, the line she needed me to understand. And when you do, you're going to tell me. Before you solve it. Before you manage it. You tell me. Yes. Every time. Every time. She looked at me for a long moment. I had seen her look at contracts this way, at crisis communication strategies, at problems that required precise assessment before action. I had never been on the receiving end of it when the stakes were personal. Then ask, she said. I had rehearsed this on the walk. I had considered 17 different phrasings and rejected all of them for being too constructed, too managed, too much like the man I was trying not to be. Will you choose this? I said. Not a contract. Not a term. Me. The silence stretched. I watched her process the question the way she processed everything, thoroughly, without rushing, giving it the weight it deserved. Yes, she said. The word landed in my chest like something coming to rest after a long fall. She texted me her apartment address at 8 that evening. No explanation, just the numbers and the street and the implicit invitation in the sending. I had never been inside her apartment. I had sent cars to pick her up, had dropped her off at the curb, had seen the building from the street. But I had never crossed the threshold into the space that was entirely hers, uncontaminated by my presence or my resources or my particular way of making everything I touched into something I controlled. The building was a walk-up in a neighborhood that still had bodegas and laundromats, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and the super lived on the ground floor. I climbed 3 flights of stairs and knocked on her door and waited. She opened it wearing soft clothes, her hair down, her feet bare. The domesticity of it undid something in me that I hadn't known was wound tight. Is this okay? I asked. She stepped back and let me in. The apartment was small and full. Books with broken spines lined a shelf by the window. Dishes sat in the drying rack beside the sink. A second plant, Gerald's sibling apparently, occupied the sill above a radiator. The space smelled like her shampoo, and something cooking, and the particular warmth of a life being lived rather than displayed. I moved through it slowly, taking inventory the way she had once moved through my penthouse, cataloging the evidence of who she was when no one was performing. You said I'd have to ask, I said. Every time. I did. Can I touch you? She crossed to me instead of answering, took my face in her hands, and I went very still beneath her palms. Not frozen. Released. The control I had spent 39 years building set down deliberately, like a weight I had been carrying without realizing it was optional. Her thumbs traced the line of my jaw, brushing the edge of the scar I never explained. I held her face in return and kissed her once, slow, complete, nothing urgent in it. Just contact. Just presence. Just the two of us in a room that belonged to her, choosing to be here. She pulled me toward the bedroom. I asked at the door, "Are you sure?" "Yes." Her eyes held mine. "Stop asking." "I'll stop when you stop making me want to be careful with you." Her hands found the buttons of my shirt, working them open one at a time with the same deliberate attention she gave everything. I shrugged the shirt off and reached for the hem of her sweater, lifting it over her head, watching the fabric clear her shoulders as her hair fell back into place. Every piece of clothing removed was a decision. Nothing rushed. Nothing forced. Just the careful dismantling of the barriers between us until there were none left. I laid her down on her bed not mine, in her space, surrounded by her things, and leaned over her. She drew me closer, her hands resting at my shoulders, steady and certain. "Tell me what you want," I said against her throat. "You. Here. Not thinking about what you should be doing." I kissed down the column of her neck, feeling her breath shift as I moved. My hand traced along her side, not searching, just there, learning the quiet language between us. Control slipped. Not all at once, but in pieces, each breath, each movement, each moment that pulled us further away from everything outside the room. "Dorian," she said, my name softer now but no less certain. I reached for the protection I had brought with me, hands less steady than I would have preferred. She watched me, her expression unreadable, her focus entirely on what was happening between us. When I moved back over her, she met me without hesitation. What followed was unhurried at first, measured, then something deeper, something that built until neither of us was thinking about anything beyond the moment we were in. "Don't hold back," she whispered. And I didn't. I let go of the careful control I had carried for years, giving her everything I had been holding back. Every guarded instinct translated into a devotion that was finally undeniable. In the hours that followed, the world outside ceased to exist. I stayed with her, our foreheads resting together as our breathing slowed in the quiet that eventually settled between us. "I love you," I said. Simple. No structure. No calculation. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at me. Her hand came up, tracing the line of my jaw, the place where who I had been met who I was trying to become. "I know," she said. "I love you too." In the morning, she made coffee at the correct ratio, dark roast, precise measurement, the competence she brought to everything, and handed me a mug across her small kitchen counter. I took it and looked at her in the light coming through the window, and I understood something that had been true for 6 months but that I had not permitted myself to name. I had built an empire because I believed resources prevented loss, and I had been wrong. Resources hadn't prevented losing her. What had prevented losing her was showing up in her office in the rain without a plan, asking instead of arranging, learning to be present without controlling the outcome. She would keep her apartment. I would never ask her not to. Her consultancy had 8 clients now. Petra had a title and a raise. Her independence remained load-bearing, and I understood that choosing me did not mean choosing to need me. It meant choosing to want me, which was different and more valuable. I set down the coffee mug. "There's something in my office safe," I said. "Something you've never seen." She waited. My mother's letters. She wrote them during her illness, before she died. I haven't read most of them in years. I paused, finding the next words. "I'd like you to read one. If you want to." The offer sat between us. Not a gesture designed to impress, not a strategic vulnerability deployed for effect. Just the truth. There were parts of me I had locked away, and I was choosing to give her the combination. She reached across the counter and took my hand. "Show me," she said. Outside the window, Brooklyn continued its morning. Traffic sounds, voices, the particular rhythm of a neighborhood waking up. Inside the apartment, the coffee cooled in our mugs, and neither of us moved to drink it, and I understood that this was what I had been building toward without knowing it. Not a merger, not an acquisition, not a contract with terms and exit clauses. Just 2 people in a kitchen, holding on.
Epilogue. 1 year later. The sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, casting a warm glow across Wren's Brooklyn apartment. It wasn't much different, apart from the plants multiplying along the windowsills. Gerald now had comrades, tiny green soldiers of peace. Dorian sat at the table, sipping coffee from a chipped mug, one of those she'd sworn she couldn't part with. A laptop was open in front of him, the screen a chaos of spreadsheets and emails that somehow felt less daunting than they ever had. Wren padded barefoot from the bedroom, hair tousled, wrapped in a robe. She offered a lazy smile, her expression tender and real. "You're still working?" "Just finished. I promise." He shut the laptop with a definitive click. "I was thinking of taking the day off, actually." Her eyes widened in mock surprise. The Dorian Foxwell, taking a day off? Truly, we're living in wild times. Miracles do happen. He chuckled, extending a hand to her. She joined him at the table, their fingers entwining naturally. A silence settled over them, comforting and easy. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked, her gaze distant for a moment. "The chaos?" He shook his head. "Maybe a little. But this is better." He gestured around the small apartment, filled with little touches of their life together. "You did change your shoes, at least. The boardroom ones wouldn't survive this street," she teased. He feigned a wounded look. "I had to learn. I wouldn't have my poor shoes suffer." They both laughed, and he marveled at how laughter had become a staple of their day. Once, every interaction had been laced with formality. Now it was all intimacy and shared vulnerability. "You know," Wren said thoughtfully, "I might have a little project that's going to need a brilliant mind. And I happen to know one." Dorian arched an eyebrow. "Is that a job offer?" "An invitation, more like. To co-create. But we have to walk across the bridge to get started." "Ah, the bridge." He nodded, recalling their many walks, the conversations, the promise of new directions. "Consider me sold." Standing, they moved to the window, overlooking the city they'd come to navigate together, the streets familiar territory now. "Your mother's letters," Wren started softly. "I'd love to see them when you're ready." He nodded. "Soon, I promise. Maybe once we clear whatever bridge this is." He gestured to their future, undefined but deeply desired. For a while they stood there, embraced by the light and the lull of the city below. Finally, Wren pulled away slightly and looked up at him. "You should know I love you, even when you're off breaking shoes." He grinned, leaning down to capture her lips with his, savoring the taste that spoke of coffee and shared mornings. "I love you too, Wren. Even when you make fun of my fashion choices." She laughed against his mouth, the merriment infectious and freeing. And in that small, utterly unremarkable kitchen in Brooklyn, Dorian knew they were building something far bigger and more precious than any contract ever could. Together, each choice a testament to their love. The city stretched out vast and inviting, no longer a realm of corporate obligations but a playground of possibilities, something they'd discovered together hand in hand. The end. This has been Contract with My Enemy, a fake engagement billionaire romance, written by M. Love. Narrated by Google Play, auto-narrated audiobook. Copyright 2020 by Blessings for All LLC. Production copyright 2026 by Blessings for All LLC.